The air in Lancaster City was thick, oppressive in its stillness, as if the very streets themselves held their breath. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows against the cracked pavement. From the towering buildings that bordered the central square to the worn cobblestones beneath, everything seemed frozen in time, stuck in a moment that was too heavy to move past. The silence felt unnatural, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your mind, reminding you of the dangers lurking in every corner, in every fleeting second. Johnny Vanduke stood at the edge of Penn Square, his eyes scanning the horizon, the weight of the city pressing against him. The city he called home, a city that had birthed so many versions of himself. He wasn't sure if that thought comforted him or disturbed him more. Lancaster, this iteration of it, felt both familiar and foreign, as though it had slipped just beyond his reach, like a dream fading upon waking. Yet, he knew it better than any other place. It was his anchor, his starting point, his foundation in the endless, chaotic expanse of timelines. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. For a moment, it almost felt like a whisper, the voice of someone calling out to him from beyond the veil of time and space. He glanced over his shoulder, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his .44 Magnum. But the street was empty, too empty. There were no passers-by, no vendors in the market, no children playing in the park across the square. Just the cold, haunting silence. He reached up, brushing a lock of hair from his face, his fingers brushing against the rough texture of his skin. He hadn't slept in days, his mind too tangled in thoughts of what was to come. The call sign network, their lifeline to the multiverse, was unstable. The imposter was out there somewhere, manipulating timelines, building armies, erasing histories, twisting realities. It was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again. But that wasn't why he was here, not today. Not yet. Today, it was the city. Lancaster. The heart of it all. The place that had birthed the Vandukes, the place they had sworn to protect. It felt like there was something waiting here, something hidden beneath the surface, something that had been waiting for him to return. Johnny's boots echoed as he took a step forward, the sound almost too loud in the stillness. His eyes flicked to the old courthouse across the street. The building was aged, its stone facade cracked and worn by centuries of history. He remembered a time, long ago, when it had stood as a symbol of something greater, a place where decisions were made, where futures were shaped. Now, it was a shell of what it once was, its halls hollow, its purpose lost to time. The courthouse had been the temporary capital of the United States during the Revolution. A strange thought, considering how far the country had come or fallen since then. But in this version of Lancaster, those echoes of the past were far more than just history. The city was a nexus, a point where everything converged. And every choice Johnny made, every step he took, rippled out across the multiverse, shaping realities in ways he couldn't always understand. He crossed the square, his mind running through the events that had led him here. The original Vanduke had left. His actions had set the stage for everything that followed, creating chaos, disrupting timelines. The imposter had been born from that chaos, a twisted reflection of what should have been. And now, Johnny was left to clean up the mess. A sudden sound caught his attention, a faint, metallic screech. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. His hand tightened on the handle of his pistol as he turned in the direction of the noise, instincts kicking in. Something was coming. At first, it was just a shadow, a blur of movement in the distance. Then it emerged fully into view, a lone figure, walking purposefully down the street. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their head down, their posture hunched against the wind. Johnny's grip on his gun loosened slightly, though his caution remained. It was just a person, or so it seemed. But the way they moved, the deliberate pace, the feeling of something wrong in their aura, it wasn't right. The figure approached, and Johnny could see their face clearly now. A woman. Her features were drawn, her eyes wide and alert, but there was something else in her expression, a kind of desperation, as if she were running from something, or perhaps, someone. The tattered flag she carried, half-staff, its edges fraying, the symbol on it barely visible, was an unmistakable mark of rebellion. The Wild Ones. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that flag. Her gaze met his, and in that instant, Johnny felt it, a flash, a vision, a ripple of time. He saw the woman, no, he felt her. Her fear. Her defiance. The deep, resonating pulse of something greater than the two of them, a shared bond in a world on the brink of something unimaginable. He saw the future, felt the weight of the multiverse pressing against his shoulders, and knew what needed to be done. The woman spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "They're coming." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "FEAR is here." Johnny nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "I know." And just like that, the quiet of Lancaster was shattered. The woman's eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. She took a few steps closer, her hands trembling as she gripped the flag tighter, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to this reality. "They came out of nowhere," she began, her voice breaking with the weight of memories she was forcing herself to relieve. "At first, it wasn't so bad. Just whispers. Little things here and there. But then, they took hold of everything. F.E.A.R. She paused, the word itself seeming to carry a weight she couldn't escape. "For every and all religion. They told us they were here to save us, to guide us, but they were lies. All of it." Johnny's eyes narrowed as he studied her, but he remained silent. He knew that look. the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had been driven to the edge by the kind of horrors most couldn't imagine. They started with the churches, she continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. They twisted faith, took it for themselves, turned it into a weapon. They had their soldiers, their priests, everything became about control. The soul, the body, the mind. They found a way to manipulate it all, to break us down from the inside. They had their eyes everywhere, cameras, monitors, machines. Nothing was sacred. Johnny looked around at the city, his eyes falling on the empty streets, the buildings that stood like silent sentinels, watching them, waiting. He had felt it before, that suffocating sense of being under constant surveillance, like every step he took was being calculated, measured. And then they came for the wild ones, she said, her gaze turning to the street in front of them. They didn't care who we were, where we came from. They just wanted to silence us. They hunted us down, piece by piece. Anyone who fought back, anyone who dared to challenge their control, they disappeared. Their families, their friends, all of them swallowed up by the void they created. Johnny's grip on his pistol tightened again. He understood now. The wild ones weren't just rebels, they were something far more dangerous to FEAR. They were the last remnants of free will, of defiance in a world where every thought, every action, was controlled. The wild ones were the cracks in the foundation FEAR had built. Why don't they just wipe us out completely? Johnny asked, his voice low. If they have all this power, all these resources. The woman glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of fear in her eyes, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows. Then, she turned back to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. They can't. Not completely. There are too many of us, and they know it. They tried. Believe me, they tried. But there's something in us they can't control. Something that fights back, no matter how hard they try. And that's where we, the wild ones, come in. Johnny's mind raced as he processed her words. He had heard of FEAR, of course, how could he not? The organization had spread like a disease across the multiverse, its influence seeping into timelines, twisting them, corrupting them. But hearing it from someone who had lived through it, fought against it, made it real in a way he hadn't fully understood before. They're scared of us, she continued, her voice gaining strength. They want to break us, mold us into something they can use. But they can't. Not as long as we keep fighting. Not as long as we remember what they're really doing. Johnny nodded, a grim determination settling in his gut. He'd always known that his existence, his purpose, was tied to something larger. But hearing this, hearing her speak of FEAR in such raw terms, made it clear. The stakes weren't just personal. They were cosmic. You've been fighting for how long? Johnny asked, his eyes scanning the woman's face, trying to gauge the depth of her story. "A long time," she said, her eyes drifting to the ground, her hands tightening around the flag. "But we've always been outmatched. FEAR has resources we can't even begin to understand. They don't just use people to fight their battles, they've got things. Machines. Soldiers. They've turned even the dead into weapons." Johnny felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The idea of machines, soldiers, and even the dead being twisted into instruments of control, it was a nightmare he had faced in other timelines. But here, it felt different. More personal. Lancaster wasn't just another battleground, it was the heart of it all, the place where it began and where it could all end. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his voice firm. "Then it's time we remind them that they can't control everything. Not here. Not now. We fight back." The woman looked up at him, her eyes narrowing, searching his face for something, some hint of resolve. Finally, she nodded. "You're right. We have to. If not for us, then for everyone who's still out there. We can't let them win." Johnny's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at her, seeing in her the same fire that burned inside him. The fight against FEAR wasn't just a battle for freedom, it was a fight for the very soul of the multiverse. And they would do whatever it took to win. "Let's move," Johnny said, his voice steady and filled with a grim certainty. "The longer we wait, the harder it gets. We take the fight to them. Here. In Lancaster." As the woman turned to follow him, the weight of their mission settled over both of them like a shroud. They were no longer just survivors. They were a rebellion in the making, and it was time for FEAR to understand that they weren't the only ones who had control over this world. This fight had just begun. Johnny's boots hit the cracked pavement with each step, the echo of his movement filling the empty streets. His hand never left the grip of his .44 Magnum, the cold weight a constant reminder of the world he lived in, a world teetering on the edge of something far darker. He moved with purpose, but even in the silence of the city, he could feel the weight of her eyes on him, waiting for him to say more. "You don't know who I am," Johnny said, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the heavy air. "Or who we are. The Vandukes." He paused, glancing up at the woman, watching her expression. He didn't expect her to understand, not fully. But she needed to. They all needed to. "You said it yourself," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the distant skyline. FEAR doesn't just want control of Lancaster, or this timeline. They want control over everything. Every possible reality. They've infected more timelines than we can even begin to count. And they won't stop until the entire multiverse is under their thumb. Johnny shook his head, his jaw tightening. The words left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I've seen it happen. I've fought against them in worlds where they've already won, where nothing is left but dust. the lives lost, the futures erased. And that's why I can't back down." The woman glanced at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Johnny could see her trying to piece together the puzzle of his existence, trying to understand the weight of what he was saying. He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair, his eyes never leaving the distant horizon. "I'm not just some guy from Lancaster City. I'm not just Johnny Vanduke. I come from a place that doesn't exist anymore, a timeline that I had to erase. I left it all behind to fix the damage. To make things right." He clenched his fist, a sharp pain shooting through his knuckles as his past, the actions he'd taken, surged up in his chest. "But in doing that, I created something worse. The imposter." He glanced over at her, locking eyes. "The imposter was me. In another timeline. I thought I could escape my mistakes. I thought if I cut myself off, everything would just stop. But it didn't. I made things worse. And now that thing, that version of me, is out there, tearing apart timelines, using android armies to crush anything that stands in his way. I can't walk away from that." His voice faltered for a moment, and he had to pause before continuing. "The Vandukes, we're the ones tasked with keeping the multiverse intact. We don't get to quit. Not when there's a threat like this. The call sign network connects us. We're bound together, each of us tied to Lancaster, each of us responsible for making sure the timeline doesn't collapse. And no matter where we come from, we all carry the same burden. But I can't do this alone. None of us can." The woman was silent for a long moment, processing everything Johnny had just shared. Her face was still drawn, haunted by what she had seen, but there was something else in her eyes now, a recognition. She was beginning to understand that Johnny wasn't just a soldier in a fight. He was a man who had lived with the consequences of his own actions, a man who couldn't escape the past no matter how far he ran. "Why don't you just leave?" she asked softly, the question tentative, but laced with the quiet curiosity of someone who had watched too many people fight for too long. "If you're the only one left, why not just disappear? Let someone else carry the burden." Johnny's lips curled into a bitter smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because running away is how it all started. Running away is what caused all this mess in the first place. I've seen worlds where people tried to escape their responsibilities, where they tried to turn their backs on the chaos they created. But it never works. The cracks just keep spreading. And eventually, it all comes crashing down. He turned back toward her, his gaze sharp, his voice steady. "I can't back down because I've seen what happens when we do. I've seen entire cities wiped out, people erased from existence like they never mattered, entire histories rewritten just to serve some twisted purpose. If I run, if I stop fighting, then the imposter wins. And so do all the other forces like him, the ones who want to control everything. I'm not doing this because I want to be some kind of hero. Hell, I don't even know if I'm the right person to lead this fight. But I know I have to try. Because if I don't, everything we've ever known, everything we've ever fought for, it's all going to be lost. There was a long silence between them, as if the weight of his words hung in the air, invisible but suffocating. The woman finally nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. Then we fight, she said simply, her voice gaining strength with every word. We fight together. The wild ones don't back down. And neither should you. Johnny gave a small, approving nod. Good, he said, his voice low, filled with quiet intensity. Then let's show them what happens when you mess with the wrong timeline. He looked at her one more time, his gaze softening just a fraction. The Vandukes aren't just the last line of defense for Lancaster. We're the last line for the entire multiverse. And no matter how dark it gets, we can't let that fall. With that, they set their eyes forward, their steps quickening as they moved through the streets of Lancaster, their mission clear. The imposter was out there, and this time, they weren't going to let him win. Johnny's breath was steady, but his mind raced. The weight of his responsibility pressed heavily on him. The city was still, and yet his mind was a blur of movement. He needed answers, needed to understand the war that was unfolding beyond this world. Beyond even Lancaster. And he knew exactly where to look for them. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world around him. His hand gripped the cold steel of his .44 Magnum, his thumb rubbing against the smooth surface of the gun's handle as he focused. In an instant, the air seemed to hum with an electric charge, and a strange weightlessness washed over him. It was like stepping into another reality, one where the rules of time and space bent and warped around him. This was night sight, the ability to see through the veil of time, to peer into the swirling currents of the multiverse, to feel the threads that bound the universes together. It wasn't just a gift, it was a curse. Every time he used it, he was forced to confront the chaos, the suffering, the shifting tides of fate that coursed through every timeline. He opened his eyes again, but the world had changed. The quiet streets of Lancaster were gone, replaced by a landscape both alien and familiar. He was floating above a vast desert, the ground below cracked and barren, stretching endlessly in all directions. A red sun burned high above, casting long shadows that danced across the sand. Johnny could feel the heat even through the ethereal vision. He could feel everything, see everything. The desert was a battleground, scorched by the remnants of war, the earth scarred from years of conflict. Johnny's gaze fixed on 5 figures in the distance, silhouetted against the dark horizon. They moved with precision, cutting through the endless expanse, their bodies flowing like shadows in the dunes. They were the wild ones. He knew them, he had seen them before, in different timelines, different realities. But now, here, in this one, he could see them clearly. They were fighting against FEAR agents, soldiers in dark, armored suits, their faces obscured by helmets that reflected the harsh, red light of the sun. The FEAR agents moved in squads, coordinated, ruthless, but no match for the wild ones. Johnny's eyes locked on the battle as it unfolded in slow motion before him. The wild ones were relentless, each one moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. One of them, a woman, wielded a blade of energy, cutting through the FEAR agents with fluid, deadly strikes. Another, a man, held his ground, his hands crackling with energy as he blasted the soldiers back with waves of force. Another wild one, a tall figure, moved with agility, dodging and weaving through the gunfire, taking down enemies with precise, quick strikes. The battle raged on, but Johnny's attention was drawn to something else, something far more significant. In the background, looming over the chaos, was the FEAR box. The enormous, dark structure stood like a monument to power, its black surface gleaming with an unnatural sheen. It was a twisted thing, a center of control that siphoned energy from the earth itself, spreading F.E.A.R's influence like a poison throughout the land. He could feel its pull, like an invisible hand, tugging at the fabric of the universe itself. The wild ones fought on, but it was clear that they were outnumbered. The desert was vast, the enemy was relentless, and the FEAR box was more than just a symbol, it was the key to everything. Johnny could see the future stretching out before him, fragmented, shifting endless possibilities, some filled with hope, others drenched in darkness. But the path to victory was clear. The wild ones could win this battle, but they had to reach the FEAR box. As the battle continued, Johnny's vision shifted. He saw more, much more. He saw a girl, just a young woman running through the dust and chaos. She was lost, her mind a fractured mess, broken by the weight of a world that had abandoned her. Her name, if he could remember it, escaped him for a moment. But the girl was important, she had a role to play. She was a part of this, a crucial figure in the fight against FEAR. She ran, but she wasn't alone. Johnny's vision stretched further back, deeper into the past, and he saw the same girl once again, but now, she was in a different place, a hospital room. There, she was shackled, trapped within the confines of a mental institution, her mind caged by F.E.A.R's cruel manipulation. But she fought, even then, against the invisible chains that held her. Her will burned, a spark of defiance in a world that wanted to erase her. He saw more, a place of refuge. The wild ones had gathered there, hidden away in the ruins of an old building, some kind of sanctuary carved into the earth. It was here that they plotted their next move, here that they took stock of the battle they had been losing for so long. Johnny saw them, he saw the others who would fight beside the girl, the ones who would help her become the wild one she was meant to be. He saw them come together, the singer, the one whose words and music inspired the masses, the lone soldier, whose heart was broken but whose resolve was stronger than steel, the former prisoner, whose dark past was woven into the very fabric of his soul. And the last one, the leader, a figure wrapped in mystery, a person whose presence could burn through the very fabric of space itself. These were the Wild Ones. Their paths had crossed and intersected, their lives bound together by fate, by the thread of FEAR. They had lost so much, but they had never stopped fighting. They were scattered across the multiverse, but they were always connected. Johnny could see the girl now, standing in front of the FEAR box, her eyes locked on the dark structure that loomed over them all. She was ready. She would be the one to ignite the final spark in the war against FEAR. She would be the one to bring it all crashing down. Johnny could feel the heat of battle, the pressure mounting, the future already on the edge of a knife. There was no turning back. The multiverse depended on this moment, on the choices they made now. The Wild Ones and their fight against FEAR wasn't just about survival, it was about reclaiming what had been lost, about standing tall in the face of overwhelming darkness. And Johnny would be there. He couldn't back down. He wouldn't. Johnny's eyes narrowed as his night sight deepened. The fabric of the multiverse unfolded before him, layers upon layers of time, space, and history shifting like the tide of an ocean. His consciousness dove through the layers, tracing the timeline of the Wild Ones, the ones who had come before him, the five that had formed the heart of the resistance against FEAR. He saw them as if they were right in front of him, each moment vivid and sharp. It all began long before the Wild Ones took on their name, when the world was still whole, before FEAR had its grip on the multiverse. In this timeline, the five of them had been individuals first. Johnny saw Andy first, his face set with determination, the kind that came with being born into a world filled with both promise and terror. He was a leader, though he didn't always know it at the time. He stood before a crowd, a musician, a visionary, his words and songs echoing through the air, inspiring those around him to rise up, to believe in something greater than the chaos that threatened to consume them. But even then, he was being hunted by FEAR, drawn into their crosshairs for his influence, for his power to rally people. Then there was Ashley, brash, quick-witted, and relentless. His voice was always louder, his actions faster, and his heart a storm of fury. But Johnny could feel the pain underneath it all, the wounds of betrayal and loss, that drove him to fight harder than anyone. Ashley was the tactician, the one who could see the paths forward, even when there were no roads left. He had been one of the first to pick up a weapon, to fight back against the creeping tendrils of FEAR that sought to swallow the world whole. Next, JYNXX, the quiet one, the watcher. He was often the shadow, the one who moved unseen, whose thoughts were his own, whose emotions were buried deep inside. Johnny could see the sorrow in his eyes, the weight of the things he had seen and done. But there was power in that quiet, an unshakable strength that the others never seemed to notice except when they needed him most. JYNXX had always been there in the background, guiding, advising, protecting in silence. CC came next, loud, defiant, a force of nature. Johnny could feel the electricity in the air when CC entered a room. He was always the one pushing forward, always the one to make a stand, to pick up the fight when no one else dared. He was fierce, unapologetically bold, a warrior whose will was as unbreakable as his steel guitar. Johnny saw CC's defiance in full force, face to face with FEAR agents, standing tall despite overwhelming odds. He wasn't afraid to take the hits. He wasn't afraid to keep fighting, no matter the cost. And last, Jake, the wild card. Jake's unpredictability made him a mystery. He was a warrior in his own right, but his true power lay in his ability to move through the world without being noticed, to blend in and strike when it was least expected. His face was full of secrets, hidden behind the mask of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and yet kept moving forward. Johnny saw him infiltrating the heart of F.E.A.R.'s operation, taking down their tech from the inside, leaving behind chaos in his wake. Jake was the one who saw the angles others couldn't, who always knew the right moment to strike. Johnny saw the five of them now, not as individuals, but as a unit. The wild ones were forged from their struggles, their pain, and their unwillingness to back down. The rebellion against FEAR wasn't just born out of a desire for freedom, it was born out of a deep, personal need to protect what they had left, to save those who couldn't save themselves. Johnny watched as they came together in the beginning, in the heart of Lancaster City. They met in secret, united by their shared vision and the looming threat of FEAR. They weren't just fighting for power or control, they were fighting for something far more important, for the soul of the world, for the souls of the people they loved. The first battle was a massacre, a desperate attempt to push back against the advancing FEAR forces. Andy stood at the front, his voice cutting through the chaos as he rallied the people. Ashley directed the attack, always moving, always calculating. JYNXX moved silently through the shadows, taking down enemies with surgical precision. CC blasted his way through the front lines, guitar in hand, his music the weapon that kept the spirits of the rebels alive. And Jake, weaving in and out of the battle, disarmed F.E.A.R's tech, creating openings that the others used to strike. The wild ones fought with everything they had, and yet, FEAR was relentless. But they had a fire within them, a fire that FEAR had underestimated. Even when they were beaten, bloodied, and broken, the wild ones never stopped. Johnny saw the rise of the FEAR box, that monstrous, mechanical heart of their empire. It loomed over the battlefield like a dark sentinel, feeding off the fear of the people, amplifying its power with every drop of suffering it collected. But even in the face of that abomination, the wild ones didn't stop. They infiltrated, they fought, they bled. It was a war of attrition, one that stretched on for years, but in every defeat, the wild ones found new strength. They became more than just rebels, they became symbols. Hope. Resistance. And through it all, Johnny could see them growing stronger, their bond deeper. But the war was far from over. Johnny could feel the weight of it, the constant battle between the wild ones and FEAR that stretched across dimensions, across timelines. And now, as Johnny watched the events unfold before him, saw the culmination of their struggle, he knew that their fight would soon reach its climax. The five of them, united by a cause greater than themselves, would either succeed in bringing FEAR to its knees or be consumed by it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the wild ones were more than just soldiers. They were a force of nature, one that could never be extinguished. Not as long as the multiverse had breath. Johnny's vision pulled back, and the desert landscape began to fade. He opened his eyes, finding himself back in Lancaster City. The weight of the past and the future hung heavy on him, but it was clear now. The wild ones were no longer just a story. They were a reality. And the battle was far from over. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like something was about to crack wide open. The voice, the cold, omnipresent voice, had spoken with authority, with a chilling confidence, taunting him, questioning his every move. You see, Vanduke, those of much greater power tried, and even after success, FEAR came back. What makes you think you can stop FEAR? Your mission will be left in rot and ruin. Your city, the whole East Coast, if not all of America, will fall, then the world. Johnny's eyes flickered, the tendrils of the multiverse swirling behind his gaze. The weight of the voice didn't waver him, but it gnawed at his insides, bringing a familiar chill. He had heard it before. The mocking tone of inevitability. The whispering force that sought to dominate, to break him. FEAR had always been there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike, to remind him of the futility of his cause. But Johnny was no stranger to this kind of challenge. He turned his gaze back to the woman. Her face remained unreadable, but Johnny saw something shift in her eyes. Doubt. Fear. And yet, something else, a sense of defiance that mirrored his own. He could feel the weight of her struggle, but something in her presence made him hesitate, even if just for a moment. With a deep breath, Johnny spoke, his voice steady and unwavering despite the invisible forces pulling at him. The mission will never end. No matter how large the task, or how many enemies stand in our way, the Vandukes will never fall. We fight because we must fight. Because if we don't, then who will? Who else will stand against the darkness that FEAR spreads, across this world, across all worlds? He took a step closer to her, his eyes locked onto hers with the weight of everything he had seen and done, all of it settling into his words. I am the original storyteller, he declared, his voice growing deeper, stronger with each passing word. I have seen it all. I've seen the rise of FEAR and the fall of kingdoms. I've seen the multiverse fracture and bleed, and I've watched worlds burn. But here, in this world, in this fight, I will not back down. Johnny's eyes burned with a quiet fury, the memories of the battles fought and lost surging forward. The Vandukes have fought enemies far worse than FEAR. We have faced the undead zombies, necromorphs. We have fought creatures of myth and terror, Wendigos, skinwalkers, the water demon. We've faced things that shouldn't exist, monsters that were never meant to be. The men behind the slaughter. Vampires. The Mothman. Dogmen. And we're winning a war against the imposter and false storyteller right now. His hand tightened around his magnum, the weight of his words heavy with the history of every battle, every foe, every victory, and loss. Johnny's gaze pierced into the woman's eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the weight of what he was about to say hanging in the air like a thunderstorm before the first crack of lightning. "You're no wild one," he shouted, his voice rising with intensity. "You work for F.E.A.R." The words rang out, sharp and accusing, and in that instant, everything seemed to shift. The defiance he had felt in her, the same fire that had once driven him to fight against F.E.A.R, flickered and faded, replaced by something darker, something colder. Johnny could see it now, the truth. Her eyes, the subtle way her stance had shifted, the way she had tried to hide her fear behind a mask of resolve. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't a wild one. She was a puppet. A tool of FEAR. Her face faltered for a moment, the mask slipping, and for a brief second, Johnny saw the flicker of truth, the cold, calculating nature of someone who had been sent here, not to join the fight, but to stop it. The woman had been lying to him. Every word she had spoken, every piece of information, was a piece of manipulation. She had been playing a part, pulling him deeper into F.E.A.R's web. "You're not one of us," Johnny spat, his voice low and venomous. You're a puppet for FEAR. The whole time, you've been feeding them information, trying to lead me into their trap. You were never meant to join the fight. You were meant to divide us. The words cut through the air like a blade, and Johnny could feel his own anger rising as the realization hit him. FEAR had sent someone to break him, to throw him off course. She wasn't just a spy, she was a weapon. The woman hesitated, and in that fleeting moment, Johnny saw the truth. There was no turning back for her now. The game was over. She had been caught in the lie. "Who sent you?" Johnny demanded, his voice low, like the growl of a predator. "Tell me, or I'll make you." For a brief moment, the woman's eyes darted around, her mind racing for an answer. The weight of the situation was too much, and the air around them grew heavier, charged with the tension of the moment. FEAR had made their move, and now, so would Johnny. In the blink of an eye, Johnny's hand moved faster than thought, the cold steel of his .44 Magnum snapping up to meet the tension in the air. Without hesitation, without mercy, the shot rang out a single, powerful crack that shattered the silence around them. The woman's body jerked violently as the bullet tore through her chest, her breath catching in a gasp of disbelief. Her eyes widened, a fleeting moment of shock before the life drained from them. The force of the shot sent her staggering backward, her hands instinctively reaching for the wound, but there was no escaping the finality of it. She collapsed to the ground, the dust rising around her as her body hit the pavement with a sickening thud. The once defiant posture, the calculated mask she had worn so well, crumbled in that instant, replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone who had miscalculated their final move. Johnny stood still, his breath steady, his gaze cold as he watched her life slip away. There was no satisfaction in the kill. No victory. Just the grim realization that, once again, FEAR had sent its agents to do their dirty work, and he had stopped them before they could succeed. The woman's body lay still, a stark contrast to the chaos Johnny had just witnessed in the multiverse, nothing but a casualty in a war that was far larger than her. Johnny's eyes were empty as he looked down at her, his hands still gripping the gun, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like an anchor. "You chose the wrong side," Johnny muttered under his breath, his voice devoid of any emotion. His eyes shifted, scanning the surrounding area. The city was still, quiet once more. The world had barely even noticed the brief disturbance. But Johnny knew. He knew that the war against FEAR wasn't just a battle for Lancaster City or even the East Coast. It was a fight for the multiverse. And as long as FEAR existed, no one was safe. He holstered the Magnum with a steady hand, his face unreadable, his heart pounding beneath the weight of the moment. The Wild Ones were his last hope. The Vandukes were his only chance. And no matter how dark, no matter how many enemies stood in his path, he would fight. He would never fall. He would never stop. Johnny stood over the body, the silence of the city pressing in on him. For a moment, he simply breathed, letting the weight of the shot settle in his chest. There was no room for hesitation now. The moment had come. He turned his back to the fallen woman, stepping into the street, his mind already racing ahead. The war wasn't just on this timeline anymore, it was everywhere. The multiverse was tearing at its seams, and every action, every decision mattered. FEAR had already planted its agents deep within the fabric of reality, but Johnny knew the truth: they could never hold back the tide forever. He reached for the device at his side, a small, unassuming piece of tech. The call sign network flickered to life, a ripple of energy pulsing through the air. Johnny could feel it in his bones, the hum of the multiverse shifting, connecting, waiting for him to make his move. The ground trembled beneath him, a reminder that he wasn't just fighting for this world. The Vandukes were fighting to protect the multiverse itself, a battle that spanned beyond any single timeline or dimension. He had seen it before, the future, twisted and destroyed by F.E.A.R's reach. But now, the future was his to shape. And if he was going to stop this, he had to act fast. The call sign network crackled. "This is Vanduke, coming through." The message echoed across the multiverse, reaching those who were tied to him, those who could help. The allies who had fought beside him, across countless realities, now joined forces for the final push. The wild ones had come a long way, but the stakes had never been higher. He wasn't alone. Not this time. In the desert, far across the dunes, the wild ones stood together. Andy, Ashley, JYNXX, CC, and Jake. Each of them fought on, still rallying together against the oncoming tide of F.E.A.R's forces. They were in the thick of it now, their resolve unbroken, their unity stronger than ever before. The FEAR box loomed in the distance, its shadow casting over the battlefield. It had been a symbol of their power for far too long, but now it was a target. They needed to take it down if they were to have any hope of stopping the rise of FEAR once and for all. The agents, an endless swarm of armored soldiers, marched forward, relentless in their attack, but they were no match for the ferocity of the wild ones. Andy was at the forefront, his voice booming as he commanded the troops around him, his presence a beacon of strength. He knew this fight was more than just a war, it was a fight for everything. For their world. For their freedom. For their future. But this battle was only one part of the war. As Johnny moved deeper into the heart of the conflict, the ground beneath him rippled with the rising tide of energy. The call sign network was working, but there was a growing instability in the fabric of time itself. He could see it, feel it, a web of distortion, stretching across the multiverse, pulling timelines together, tearing them apart. FEAR was playing a long game, using their influence to warp the very fabric of reality. He saw Jake, standing alone at the edge of the battlefield. The chaos raged around him, but Jake was calm, focused. He wasn't fighting the battle the way others did. He was working behind the scenes, infiltrating the systems, cutting off the enemy's communication, and setting up the traps that would turn the tide in their favor. Ashley joined him next, directing their attacks with surgical precision, targeting the weak points in F.E.A.R's strategy, exploiting their every flaw. CC was a force of nature in the front lines, moving like a whirlwind of destruction, his guitar in hand, every strum shaking the very earth beneath him, sending shock waves through the enemy. His presence alone made the agents hesitate, an unexpected, powerful force that FEAR could not predict. And JYNXX, the quiet one, was everywhere, slipping through the chaos, cutting down enemies before they even realized he was there. His stealth and precision were unmatched, and while the others fought the obvious battle, JYNXX was dismantling F.E.A.R's forces from within. Johnny's vision shifted again. The fabric of time had unraveled before him, a cascade of memories and realities overlapping. He saw the countless battles the Vandukes had fought, the victories and the losses. The scars that they had carried with them, the pain of every world they had tried to save. But they had never stopped. They couldn't. He saw the imposter, a twisted reflection of himself, a perversion of what he had become. The imposter was chaos, destruction, and in every timeline where the Vandukes had faltered, the imposter had capitalized on it. He was the dark shadow over everything Johnny had fought for. The war, the true war, was not just in one timeline or one place. It was everywhere. And if Johnny and the Wild Ones were to have any chance of victory, they needed to strike at the heart of F.E.A.R's operation. They needed to shut down the FEAR box. Only then would the multiverse have a chance of healing. The battle intensified, the energy growing with every passing moment. Johnny could see the Wild Ones charging forward, rallying together as one force, unstoppable in their mission. He could see Andy's face, hard and determined, leading them toward the FEAR box. His eyes locked on the target, his every move calculated. But the war had only just begun. The imposter's armies were vast, and the fabric of time was fragile. The moment they struck the FEAR box, they would trigger a chain reaction that could alter everything. Johnny's grip tightened on his weapon, the weight of his role in this war pressing down on him. He was the storyteller, the original. He had seen the end before. He had seen the chaos, the destruction. But he had also seen hope. He had seen the Wild Ones rise, stronger than ever, and he knew they could win. But it would take everything. The multiverse was at stake, and this time, Johnny was determined to make sure they would win. No matter the cost. The sky above Lancaster City split open, a jagged rift of blackened clouds tearing through the atmosphere as though reality itself was being sliced apart. Johnny felt it before he saw it, an immense, suffocating weight settling in the air, like the breath of a beast waiting to exhale. The ground beneath him shook as the FEAR box began to expand, its massive, mechanical form stretching outward from the center of the city, its cold, dark edges creeping across the horizon. It loomed over the city like an unstoppable force of nature, its power seeping into every crack, every corner, corrupting everything it touched. Johnny's eyes narrowed as the FEAR box continued to grow, a towering, oppressive structure that seemed to feed off the fear and desperation of the city around it. The towering black monolith pulsed with dark energy, its presence suffocating, like the beating heart of a machine that was draining the life from the city itself. It was here, it had arrived, and it was spreading its influence over every inch of Lancaster, infecting the air, the ground, the people. He could see them F.E.A.R agents flooding the streets, their black armor gleaming under the dim light. They moved like a well-oiled machine, a force of calculation and precision, spreading out across the city. Their helmets glinted with cold, unfeeling eyes, their weapons raised, ready to crush anything in their path. The sound of their boots on the pavement was a steady, rhythmic beat, a drum of war echoing in the streets. Johnny's pulse quickened as his eyes flicked between the agents and the expanding FEAR box. This was it. The final confrontation. The moment where everything would either be lost or won. He didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, Johnny drew his .44 Magnum from its holster, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the chaos. He could feel the power of the weapon, the energy of the call sign network humming faintly through the air as it resonated with his very soul. He wasn't just fighting for Lancaster. He wasn't even just fighting for the multiverse. He was fighting for his own redemption. For every lost timeline, for every life taken by FEAR. He had been through it all before, but this time, he wouldn't let the darkness win. Johnny stepped forward, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement, the noise of battle already ringing out in the distance. He could see the Wild Ones fighting in the distance, Andy leading the charge, Ashley coordinating the strikes, Jake slipping through the shadows, CC causing destruction with every move, JYNXX cutting down enemies with ruthless efficiency. But Johnny knew he couldn't wait for them. He had to act now. The first FEAR agent spotted him from a block away, their eyes narrowing behind the reflective visor of their helmet. Without a word, the agent raised their weapon, aiming straight at Johnny's chest. Johnny didn't flinch. He fired. The bullet tore through the air, finding its mark with deadly precision. The FEAR agent collapsed to the ground, lifeless, the sound of the shot ringing in the air. Johnny didn't wait to see the body hit the ground before he was moving again, sprinting toward the center of the street, where more agents were gathering. A second agent lunged at him, their weapon crackling with energy. Johnny ducked under the swing, his magnum rising in a smooth, practiced motion. The shot rang out again, this time hitting the agent square in the chest. They crumpled, falling into the street with a metallic clang as their armor hit the ground. Johnny was already moving, his feet a blur as he darted between alleyways, using the shadows of the city to his advantage. FEAR agents were everywhere, swarming like locusts, filling every corner of the street, their numbers overwhelming. But Johnny didn't care about the odds. He had faced worse, and he knew the city, these streets, better than any of them. He reloaded his gun with swift, practiced movements, each round slipping into place with a dull click. He could hear the agents moving closer now, their footsteps echoing in unison, a wave of fear that threatened to drown him. But Johnny had felt it all before, the weight of fear, the crushing despair of impossible odds. And he had overcome it every time. He wasn't going to let FEAR win now. Another agent appeared from the shadows, their weapon raised, but Johnny was faster. He fired first, the shot hitting them in the shoulder and sending them staggering back. The agent barely had time to recover before Johnny was on them, his fist connecting with their helmet with a brutal punch. The helmet cracked, and with one swift move, Johnny knocked the agent out cold. But as the last agent fell to the ground, Johnny's eyes flicked back toward the FEAR box. It was growing ever larger, its dark influence now touching every corner of the city. He could feel the weight of its power pressing down on him. It was time to make his move. He sprinted toward the heart of the city, toward the box, feeling the air crackle with energy as he neared it. His vision sharpened as he saw the wild ones converging at the base of the structure. They were ready. They were waiting. Johnny joined them, his eyes locking onto the massive monolith before them. The FEAR box had to be destroyed if they had any hope of stopping F.E.A.R's reign. He could feel the crackling energy of the box, the dark tendrils of its influence reaching out, suffocating the very heart of Lancaster. "Ready?" Johnny asked, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing in his chest. Andy, standing at the front, gave him a hard look, his voice calm but determined. "Always." The wild ones, together at last, stood in defiance of F.E.A.R's dark forces. They were the last hope for the city, for this multiverse. And they would fight until their last breath, no matter what it took. Johnny took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the FEAR box, as the storm of war raged around them. This was the final battle, the war that would determine everything. And Johnny Vanduke wasn't about to lose. Not today. With a single command, they charged, the weight of the multiverse on their shoulders. The skies above crackled, and the final war against FEAR had begun. The ground shook beneath them as Johnny and the wild ones charged forward, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The air itself felt thick with tension, as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The FEAR box loomed ahead, its massive, dark form towering over the streets of Lancaster, its sharp edges gleaming ominously under the burning red sky. The sound of battle raged in the distance, but here, in this moment, everything seemed to slow. Each step closer to the box felt like a step closer to the heart of the storm. Johnny's heart raced as he tightened his grip on the .44 Magnum. His eyes swept over his comrades Andy, Ashley, JYNXX, CC, and Jake, each one of them moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They were ready. This was their moment. The war that had raged across countless timelines, the battles against enemies that should never have existed, the endless struggle against FEAR, it all led to this. No more running. No more hiding. They reached the base of the FEAR box, its dark, metallic surface humming with energy, almost alive with the power it had stolen from the city. Johnny could feel it, a sense of despair, a weight on his chest, as if the very essence of the box was draining the life from everything around it. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of everything FEAR had become. control, domination, the end of all things. He saw the agents closing in, FEAR soldiers flanking the box, their black armor gleaming in the dying light. They moved in perfect coordination, their eyes locked on the wild ones, ready to crush them. The wild ones couldn't hold back now. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Without a word, Johnny raised his gun, firing at the nearest FEAR agent. The shot rang out, piercing the air with deadly precision, and the agent collapsed, a crumpled heap of metal and flesh. But there were too many more. The wild ones didn't hesitate. Andy was first to move, charging forward, his voice rising above the din of battle. "Now," he shouted, his hand raising in a signal to attack. Ashley and JYNXX sprinted to the side, flanking the agents with tactical precision. Ashley's eyes darted between targets, calculating every move as he fired off shots, each one hitting its mark. JYNXX was a blur of motion, darting through the chaos, his blades flashing as he took down FEAR agents with cold, ruthless efficiency. Jake disappeared into the shadows, moving like a ghost, leaving confusion in his wake. He disabled F.E.A.RS tech with ease, cutting through their defenses from within, sending agents into disarray as they lost their communication and coordination. CC was in the thick of it, a whirlwind of destruction. His guitar, now a weapon in his hands, sent waves of sonic energy blasting into FEAR agents, sending them flying through the air with the force of each blast. The ground shook with every chord, and the very air seemed to crackle with power as he pushed forward, a man possessed by a singular goal: victory. Johnny moved with them, a constant presence amidst the chaos. He fired at the advancing agents, each shot taking down another, each bullet another step closer to the box. But it was becoming clear taking down the agents wasn't enough. They needed to destroy the FEAR box. And the closer they got, the more they could feel its influence trying to tear at their resolve. Johnny felt the weight of it, the pressure of F.E.A.RS power, pressing in on his mind. The multiverse was unraveling at the edges, the timelines fracturing, their bonds weakening. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He turned to Andy, who was making his way toward the center of the FEAR box, his eyes locked on the heart of it. Johnny knew what Andy was thinking. It was the only way to end this. "Ready?" Johnny shouted over the noise of the battle. "Always," Andy replied, his voice filled with grim determination. With a single motion, Johnny and Andy pushed forward, breaking through the last line of FEAR agents. As they neared the box, Johnny could see at the core. The heart of the FEAR box, pulsing with dark energy, wrapped in layers of unbreakable metal. It was protected by a force field, the final barrier between them and their victory. JYNXX. Johnny shouted. JYNXX was there in an instant, his eyes locked on the force field. Without a word, he moved to the side, setting up a device he had pulled from his pack, something designed to disrupt the box's energy field. The device hummed to life, its lights flickering, and with a deafening crack, the force field around the box flickered and died. The wild ones converged on the heart of the FEAR box, their final assault beginning in that moment. They didn't hesitate. Ashley and CC covered them, laying down a wall of fire to protect the group, while Jake moved in to disable the remaining defense systems. They were so close now, so close to victory. Johnny's hand reached for the device embedded in the box, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. He felt it, deep inside the power of the FEAR box, the weight of its existence, and the responsibility to stop it. He closed his eyes for a brief second, the faces of his fallen comrades flashing before his eyes. The countless timelines they had saved, the people they had protected. And then, in a single, fluid motion, he pressed the button. The world exploded. The FEAR box crumpled in on itself, the immense power that had kept it alive suddenly consumed by the core's instability. A wave of energy pulsed outward, shaking the city to its foundation, sending shock waves through the air. For a moment, everything went silent. And then, the city erupted in a deafening roar. The box began to collapse in on itself, the power that had once fed it now turning against it. F.E.A.R's grip on Lancaster, on the multiverse, was broken. But it wasn't over yet. Johnny looked around, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the battlefield. The FEAR agents were retreating, but there was no time to rest. The imposter was still out there, and the war wasn't won until FEAR was completely erased. But as the dust settled, Johnny felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had won this battle. And in this moment, that was enough. The wild ones stood together, their victory solidified, their bond unbreakable. The war had only just begun, but Johnny knew one thing for sure: they would never stop fighting. Not as long as there was breath in their lungs. Not as long as the multiverse needed them. Johnny Vanduke looked up at the sky. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he saw the possibility of a world free from FEAR. And he would fight until that world was a reality. The battlefield lay in ruins around them, the once imposing FEAR box now nothing more than a pile of crumpled, twisted metal and glowing embers. The sky overhead had begun to clear, the blood-red clouds dissipating into wisps of light, as if the very heavens themselves were exhaling a breath of relief. The distant sounds of retreating FEAR agents echoed through the city streets, but for now, the chaos had subsided. Johnny Vanduke stood at the center of it all, the weight of the victory settling slowly over him. His chest still rose and fell with the rhythm of battle, the pounding of his heart an unsteady reminder that he had survived. The wild ones were scattered across the rubble, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph, but the war was not yet over. The imposter, F.E.A.R's twisted puppet master, was still out there, waiting for his next move. But for now, there was time to breathe. Time to reflect. Johnny made his way toward the others, his boots crunching against the debris. Andy was sitting on a broken chunk of concrete, his legs crossed, gazing out at the horizon as if searching for something. Ashley leaned against the ruins of a building, his arms crossed over his chest, the stoic expression on his face hiding the weariness beneath. Jake sat on the hood of a burned-out car, his eyes distant, as if lost in thought. CC was a few feet away, playing with the strings of his guitar, the soft sound of his fingers strumming a quiet melody amidst the stillness. JYNXX sat by himself, eyes closed, letting the cool air settle over him, the quiet calm of the aftermath reflecting in his posture. They had all been through hell. And they had come out on the other side, battered but unbroken. Johnny sat down next to Andy, taking a seat on the concrete beside him. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, neither of them rushing to fill it with words. Finally, Andy spoke. "You ever wonder if this is all we'll ever do?" Andy's voice was low, almost contemplative, the weight of his own thoughts heavy in the air. Fighting. Struggling. It seems like no matter how many battles we win, there's always something else coming. Another enemy, another fight. Sometimes, it feels like the war will never end. Johnny didn't look at him right away, his eyes drifting across the city, taking in the broken skyline, the remnants of the battle. "I've wondered that a lot, actually," he admitted quietly. "But I think that's just the way it is. The fight never ends. Not for us. Not for the Vandukes." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I guess that's what makes us different, in a way. The wild ones, the Vandukes, we're here for a reason. We fight because we know there's always something worth saving. Even when it feels hopeless, even when everything seems lost, we keep going. We have to." Ashley chuckled softly from his spot against the building, his voice rough but with a hint of amusement. "I don't think any of us would know what to do if we weren't in the middle of a fight. Hell, I know I wouldn't." "True," Johnny agreed with a small grin. "It's what keeps us moving. But it's more than that. It's the people. It's the city. It's the multiverse itself. There's something about fighting for something bigger than yourself. It gives you purpose, even when the odds are stacked against you." Jake looked over at them from his perch on the car, his expression unreadable, but his voice cutting through the air like a quiet storm. "Yeah, purpose, but how much can you lose before it doesn't matter anymore? We've all seen too much. Lost too much. Hell, I used to think I was just a kid, you know. Then I had to grow up real fast. That's what the multiverse does to you. Makes you grow up, whether you're ready or not. Johnny turned his gaze toward Jake, his eyes meeting the other man's. I know what you mean. I wasn't always the person I am now. Hell, I didn't even know who I was half the time. He paused, his thoughts swirling for a moment before he continued. I used to think I could escape my past. But the past doesn't let you go. And the longer you run, the more it catches up with you. I've seen things that would break most people. Done things I'd rather forget. But that's the price of being who we are. The price of being a Vanduke. I used to think about the same thing, CC added, his guitar strumming stopping as he leaned back, his gaze distant. Fighting all the time, it's exhausting. But when you've got nothing else, when you're living in the middle of a war, it's all you know. So you keep going. You fight because it's the only thing that feels real. Johnny nodded, understanding exactly what they meant. The weight of the past, the fear of what lay ahead, it all felt like one long, endless battle. But that was the price they had to pay for being the ones who held the line. The ones who refused to give in, even when the world was falling apart around them. He turned to JYNXX, who had been silent up until now, his eyes still closed, his face calm. Johnny's voice softened. What about you, JYNXX? You've been through more than any of us. What keeps you going? JYNXX opened his eyes slowly, meeting Johnny's gaze, his face still unreadable. He took a long breath before speaking. I've always known I was different. Always felt it, even when I was just a kid. I was always the quiet one, the one who stayed in the shadows. But I've learned something over the years. Being in the shadows doesn't mean you're powerless. You don't have to be at the front to make a difference. You just have to know where to strike. That's what keeps me going. Even when it's darkest, even when everything feels lost, I can still find a way to change things. Johnny smiled, his respect for JYNXX clear in his eyes. They all had their reasons for fighting, their own personal demons and histories they carried with them. But together, they were unstoppable. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long battle, when the dust settles and you find yourself standing among the wreckage, knowing that you've done everything you could. They were tired, but they were still standing. And that was enough for now. Johnny looked at each of them, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. The war's not over. Not by a long shot. But for now, we've earned a moment of peace. And for the first time in a long while, Johnny Vanduke allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. The wind picked up, brushing against their faces as they sat among the rubble, the warmth of the setting sun cutting through the shadows of the city. For a brief moment, the world felt still, like they had carved out a space, a small pocket of peace in the chaos that had ruled their lives for so long. It was almost as if the city itself was taking a breath, healing in the wake of the battle that had raged through its streets. Johnny shifted, leaning back against the broken wall of a nearby building, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sky, once dark and threatening, had begun to clear, the colors of twilight painting the air with soft purples and oranges. It felt almost surreal, like a dream that couldn't be real. But it was real. They were alive. They had won for now. He glanced at his companions Andy, Ashley, JYNXX, CC, and Jake, each of them sitting in their own space, their thoughts lost in the silence that enveloped them. They were all different, each carrying their own burdens, but here, in this moment, they were united. "You ever think we'll get a break?" Ashley asked, his voice breaking the quiet, but there was no bitterness in his tone, just a genuine curiosity. He took a drag from his cigarette, the ember flickering briefly in the dimming light. "Like, really get a chance to just live, you know." Johnny let out a soft chuckle, leaning his head back against the wall. He could feel the weight of exhaustion in his muscles, a kind of tiredness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the kind of tiredness that came from a lifetime of fighting, of never knowing when the next battle would come, of always being ready for the fight even when you didn't want to. "I used to think about that," Johnny said, his voice quieter now, more introspective. "Used to dream about what life would be like without all this. Without the constant running, the constant fighting. But I've come to realize, maybe this is the life we're meant for. The Vandukes. The wild ones. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. We don't get to choose when the fight ends." Andy spoke up, his voice calm but firm, the words carrying the weight of everything he had been through. "You think any of us could really walk away from this? From the fight? From what we've become?" He shook his head, his eyes distant. "We're fighters, Johnny. It's what we do. It's who we are. I used to wonder if we could ever just stop," Jake added, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I mean, what does it mean to be alive when the fight never ends? What does it mean to be human when you're constantly fighting for survival?" Johnny met his gaze, understanding the question more than he wanted to admit. There was no easy answer. The world they lived in wasn't one where they could just walk away. They were bound to the fight, not by choice, but by the very nature of what they were. They had been forged in battle, and there was no escaping that. "But we're not just fighting for survival," Johnny said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're fighting for something more. We're fighting for hope. For the future. For everyone who doesn't have a voice in this fight." JYNXX opened his eyes, the quiet warrior looking up from his spot in the shadows. His voice was calm, but there was a fire in it, a quiet strength that always lay beneath his exterior. "Hope? Maybe. But it's also about balance. We're part of something bigger than ourselves, sure. but we're also part of the story. A story that's bigger than any one of us. Maybe that's what makes the fight worth it. Johnny looked at him, the words resonating deep within. They were all part of something larger than themselves, each one carrying a piece of the story that would shape the future. They weren't just soldiers. They weren't just fighters. They were the ones who held the line, the ones who kept the chaos at bay. And what about the rest of the multiverse? CC spoke up, his voice rough but resolute. He strummed his guitar softly, the sound filling the silence between them. What happens when the battle ends here, and we've won? What about the other worlds, the other places? What happens when the Vandukes are gone? Will someone else take our place? Johnny's gaze drifted back to the horizon, the soft hues of the setting sun painting the sky with a beauty that felt almost out of place in a world that had seen so much darkness. Maybe someone else will take our place. Maybe the next generation of Vandukes will rise, and they'll fight their own battles. But the war will never end. Not really. It can't. There will always be something out there trying to break the balance. Trying to take control. Andy nodded, the weight of his words settling over them all. But as long as we're here, as long as we fight, we'll keep the darkness at bay. We'll keep it from taking everything. The silence stretched out, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with tension or doubt. It was a quiet understanding. They were still here. Still fighting. And as long as they stood together, they would continue to fight, no matter what came next. Johnny stood up slowly, his muscles aching, but the fire still burning within him. We've got a long road ahead of us. The imposter's still out there. And there are other threats. But for now, he paused, looking at the wild ones, each of them weary but unbroken. For now, we've earned this. We've earned the right to rest. Ashley exhaled a long breath, tossing his cigarette aside and standing with the others. You're right. For once, we can take a moment. We've done the impossible. We've stopped F.E.A.R. And we'll keep doing it, Johnny said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of their shared resolve. Because we're the ones who will never back down. We're the ones who will always keep fighting. And we'll make sure that when the time comes, the world will know what we did. The wild ones gathered together, each of them standing taller, even in the aftermath of the battle. There was still so much left to do, so much left to fight for. But for the first time in a long time, Johnny felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had won this battle. And with that, they had carved out a space in the war, a space where hope could take root. The city began to settle, the faint hum of life returning to the streets as the dust of the battle drifted away on the evening breeze. Lancaster, scarred but standing, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its wounds visible but healing. The remnants of F.E.A.R's influence still lingered in the shadows, but their presence was weakening. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was calm. Johnny stood with the wild ones, their silence now reflective, no longer weighed down by the immediacy of survival. They had fought, they had won this battle, and now, for a fleeting moment, they could consider something beyond the fight. Beyond the war. Feels different, doesn't it? Ashley broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual, his usual sharp edge softened. He gestured toward the city skyline, now tinged with the warm, golden hues of the setting Sunday like. I don't know, like it's ours again. Johnny nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The multiverse was vast, filled with infinite timelines and countless battles, but this city, this version of Lancaster, was special. It was the heart of the Vandukes' legacy, the place where everything began. And now, it was a city reborn. It is ours, Johnny said simply, his voice carrying a quiet strength. We've earned it. The wild ones exchanged glances, their expressions softening. The fight had hardened them, turned them into warriors, but here, in this moment, they felt human again. The tension that had gripped them for so long seemed to ease, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. CC plucked a quiet tune on his guitar, the melody floating gently in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos of the battle that had raged just hours before. It was a sound of resilience, of recovery, and it seemed to wrap around them like a protective blanket, shielding them from the weight of what lay ahead. So, what now? Jake asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. We pushed back FEAR, for now at least. The city's still standing. Do we just rebuild? Johnny considered the question for a long moment, his eyes scanning the streets below, where people were beginning to emerge from their hiding places. They moved cautiously, their faces marked by fear and hope in equal measure, but they were there. They were alive. We helped them, Johnny said finally, his tone resolute. We rebuild the city. We give them back what FEAR tried to take. Hope. A chance to live without looking over their shoulders every second of every day. Andy stepped forward, his gaze steady. That's what we've been fighting for all along, isn't it? Not just to survive, but to live. To give people a reason to believe there's something better out there. Exactly, Johnny said. He turned to face the group, his voice taking on a tone of quiet command. We can't change everything overnight. But we can start here. With this city. We've spent so long fighting, so long focused on the next battle, that we've forgotten what we're fighting for. It's time we remember. Ashley snorted softly, a wry grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. What? So we're construction workers now? Didn't think that was part of the job description. It's all part of the job, Johnny said with a smirk. Building something better is just another kind of fight. And honestly, I think it's one we can win. The wild ones nodded in agreement, their exhaustion giving way to a quiet determination. The war wasn't over, but for now, they had a chance to do more than just survive. They had a chance to make something new, something lasting. Over the days that followed, the city began to come alive again. Johnny and the Wild Ones worked alongside the people of Lancaster, helping clear the rubble, rebuilding homes, and offering protection where it was needed. The people, at first hesitant, began to warm to them, their gratitude spilling over in small acts of kindness, a meal shared, a word of thanks, a smile that said more than words ever could. Johnny found himself drawn to the quiet moments, the ones where the weight of the multiverse seemed to lift, if only for a little while. He watched as children played in the streets again, their laughter filling the air where once there had only been fear. He saw families rebuilding their homes, their hands steady, their eyes filled with hope. And he felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of peace. The Wild Ones, too, seemed to change. Andy's commanding presence softened, replaced by a quiet determination to guide the people around him. Ashley, ever the skeptic, found himself teaching others how to defend themselves, his sharp wit tempered by an unexpected patience. CC's music became a constant presence in the city, his melodies lifting the spirits of everyone who heard them. Jake and JYNXX worked tirelessly, their skills in strategy and stealth now turned toward rebuilding, their focus unshakable. Johnny spent his days moving through the city, lending a hand where it was needed, his .44 Magnum holstered but always within reach. He knew the peace wouldn't last forever. FEAR was still out there, and the imposter was a threat that couldn't be ignored. But for now, for this moment, he allowed himself to believe that they were making a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson, Johnny stood on a rooftop, looking out over the streets below. The Wild Ones joined him, one by one, their presence a quiet reminder that he was not alone. "Think we're doing enough?" Andy asked, his voice quiet but steady. Johnny didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "For now, yeah. We're giving them a chance to breathe. A chance to hope. That's enough. And after this?" JYNXX asked, his tone thoughtful. "What happens when FEAR comes back?" Johnny turned to face them, his expression resolute. "We'll be ready. But until then, we live. We build. And we remember what we're fighting for." The Wild Ones nodded, their resolve mirrored in their faces. Together, they looked out over the city, a city that was healing, a city that was finding its way back to life. For now, they had peace. And for now, that was enough. The nights in Lancaster grew quieter, the city gradually reclaiming a rhythm it had long forgotten. The scars of war remained: shattered windows, blackened streets, and the occasional tremor of unease, but they were no longer the defining features of the city. Instead, laughter began to echo in the alleys, The hum of conversation filled the air, and music drifted from open windows as life crept back into every corner. Johnny Vanduke sat on the edge of a low rooftop, his feet dangling over the side as he watched the street below. Lanterns strung between the buildings bathed the neighborhood in warm, golden light. People moved through the streets, carrying tools, supplies, and the occasional bundle of flowers. Children ran past, their laughter rising above the sounds of hammers and saws. The rebuilding had become more than just physical, it was a rebirth of the city's spirit. Johnny leaned back, resting his palms against the cool surface of the roof. The wind tugged at his coat, and he let his mind wander. It wasn't often he allowed himself moments like this. The ever-present tension in his chest, the sense of being haunted by time, by duty, had loosened, if only slightly. It was still there, but quieter now, like a distant drum beat. Lost in thought, or just catching your breath? Andy's voice broke through the quiet, his tone light but carrying a note of curiosity. Johnny turned his head to see Andy climbing onto the roof, his black jacket slightly dusted from the work they'd been doing earlier. He walked over and sat down beside Johnny, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Maybe a bit of both, Johnny admitted with a small smile. Not every day you get to see a city start over. I'm trying to take it in. Andy nodded, his gaze following Johnny's to the street below. It's something, isn't it? Watching people come back together like this. For so long, it felt like all we did was fight and break things apart. Now, he gestured to the scene below, the quiet vibrancy of life returning to Lancaster. Now, it's different. Yeah, Johnny agreed, his voice soft. Different. But in a good way. The rooftop door creaked open again, and the rest of the wild ones joined them. CC carried his guitar, strumming idly as he found a spot to sit. Ashley leaned against the wall, a cigarette perched between his fingers. JYNXX and Jake sat near the edge, their eyes scanning the city with quiet intensity. You know, CC began, his fingers dancing across the strings, if you'd told me a few months ago we'd be sitting on a rooftop watching people rebuild, I'd have called you crazy. I'd have agreed, Ashley muttered, taking a drag of his cigarette. This isn't what I thought we'd be doing. But I don't hate it. Neither do I, JYNXX added, his voice calm but reflective. It feels right. Like we're finally doing something more than just surviving. Jake nodded, his gaze still fixed on the street below. It's strange, though. This piece, it's almost unsettling. Like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Johnny let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. It's not strange, Jake. It's normal. When you've been fighting as long as we have, peace feels like a trap. Like something's lurking just around the corner. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. Andy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So what do we do? How do we hold on to this? Because you and I both know this isn't going to last forever. Johnny's smile faded, and he exhaled a slow breath. We hold on by living in the moment. By doing everything we can to make this peace worth it, even if it's temporary. We build. We connect. And when the fight comes back, and we'll be ready. But until then, we live. The group fell into a comfortable silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. CC's guitar filled the air with a gentle melody, a sound that seemed to reflect the hope and uncertainty of the moment. The wild ones had spent so long in the thick of battle, so long fighting for survival, that this quiet felt foreign. But it was a welcome change. JYNXX broke the silence, his voice low but firm. I think it's more than just peace. It's about creating something that lasts. Something that can stand on its own when we're not here anymore. If we can do that, maybe all this fighting will have been worth it. Johnny nodded, his gaze steady. You're right. That's what this is about. Leaving something behind that's better than what we found. As the hours passed, the group stayed on the rooftop, their conversation drifting between light-hearted banter and deeper reflections. The weight of the past still lingered, but it felt lighter now, softened by the shared hope of a brighter future. For the first time in years, Johnny allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't permanent, but it was real. And in that moment, as the wild ones sat together under the fading light of the day, it was enough. As the night deepened, the faint hum of Lancaster City's recovery buzzed below the rooftop. The wild ones sat in silence, their bond unspoken yet deeply felt. The stars above seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself acknowledged the calm they had helped create. Johnny leaned back, his gaze shifting between his companions and the skyline. He knew what needed to happen next. The wild ones had their place, their fight waiting for them beyond this timeline. They had been pulled into his world by circumstance, by the intertwining of battles against FEAR, but this wasn't their home. Not truly. He took a deep breath and sat up, drawing the group's attention with the motion. I think it's time, he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Andy looked at him, his expression unreadable but not surprised. Time for what? He asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Johnny met his gaze, his tone steady. Time for you to go home. You've done more than anyone could have asked here, but your fight, the one that's yours, is still out there. Lancaster will heal, but your world still needs you. The wild ones exchanged glances, the weight of Johnny's words settling over them. They all knew he was right. The FEAR box had been destroyed here, but their mission back in their own timeline wasn't over. Their world still bore the scars of F.E.A.R.'s oppression, and they were the only ones who could finish what they started. Ashley let out a long breath, tossing his cigarette aside. You're not wrong, Vanduke. Doesn't make it any easier, though. CC strummed a melancholy chord on his guitar, his fingers moving almost absent-mindedly. Yeah. Feels like we just got here, you know. Like we were finally starting to make some real progress. Johnny gave a small, understanding smile. You've made progress, more than you realize. What you've done here, it's given the city a chance to rebuild, to hope. And that's something they'll carry with them, long after you're gone. Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. So how do we do this? I mean, it's not like we can just walk out of here and find a portal back home. Johnny's expression shifted, his confidence growing. Actually, you can. The call sign network has enough energy now. It's not perfect, but it can get you back to your timeline. I've made sure of it. JYNXX nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. Then it's decided. We go back. But before we do, he paused, his gaze steady. Thank you, Vanduke. For everything. Johnny stood, offering a hand to each of them. No, thank you. The wild ones have shown me what it means to keep fighting, even when it seems like the odds are impossible. You've reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there's light. Andy stood last, his hand resting on Johnny's shoulder. Same to you. You've got a hell of a fight ahead of you, Johnny. Don't let FEAR take what you've built here. Johnny smirked. They won't. I promise you that. The group descended from the rooftop, walking through the quiet streets of Lancaster. The call sign device hummed faintly in Johnny's hand, its energy flickering with the multiverse's pulse. They reached an open square, where the stars above seemed to shine the brightest, casting their light over the city. Johnny activated the device, the air around them shimmering as a portal began to form. It was a swirling mass of light and energy, a doorway back to the Wild One's timeline. Andy turned to Johnny, his expression resolute. Take care of yourself, Vanduke. And take care of them. He gestured to the city around them. Johnny nodded. You too. And when you get back, finish what you started. One by one, the Wild Ones stepped through the portal, their figures silhouetted against the swirling light. Andy was the last to go, pausing for a moment to give Johnny a final nod before disappearing into the vortex. The portal flickered, then faded, leaving only the quiet hum of Lancaster streets behind. Johnny stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the portal had been. The silence felt heavier now, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the promise of what they had accomplished together and what still lay ahead. He turned back toward the city, his steps steady as he walked through the streets. The Wild Ones had returned to their fight, and now it was his turn to focus on his own. The multiverse still needed him, and Lancaster City was still healing. Johnny wandered through the quiet streets of Lancaster, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The city felt alive again, but it wasn't the same as before. It never would be. That was the nature of war. It changed everything it touched, leaving marks that no amount of time could fully erase. But it also forged something new in its wake, something stronger, more resilient. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the woman, the one who had confronted him at the beginning of all this, her words a challenge that still echoed in his mind. What makes you think you can stop FEAR? Your mission will be left in rot and ruin. Your city, the whole East Coast, if not all of America, will fall, then the world. Her voice, laced with doubt and venom, had lingered in his thoughts for days after he'd taken her down. She had believed so deeply in F.E.A.R's inevitability, in the futility of resistance. To her, their control was absolute, their power unstoppable. But she had been wrong. Johnny stopped at the edge of Penn Square, his eyes drawn to the soldiers' and sailors' monument standing tall in the center. Its presence was a reminder of another time, another fight, one where people had stood together against impossible odds. And they had won. He leaned against a nearby bench, his thoughts heavy as he replayed her words in his mind. Her belief in F.E.A.R's dominance had been absolute, but so had her underestimation of him, of what the Vandukes stood for. She hadn't understood, not really. She didn't understand that the mission wasn't about winning or losing, about victory or defeat. It was about never stopping. About standing up, again and again, no matter how many times the darkness tried to pull you down. She was wrong, Johnny murmured to himself, his voice low but resolute. His breath fogged in the cool night air, but his tone carried the warmth of certainty. The mission doesn't end. It can't. Because as long as there's someone out there who needs saving, someone worth fighting for, we'll be there. He clenched his fists, the memory of her final moments flashing in his mind. She had tried to break him, to make him question himself, but all she had done was solidify his resolve. He didn't need to prove her wrong, she had done that herself. Johnny's gaze lifted to the horizon, where the faintest glimmers of dawn were beginning to appear, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The city was waking up, its people ready to face another day. They had survived F.E.A.R's invasion. They were rebuilding, living. And that was proof enough that the mission mattered. That the fight was worth it. He smiled faintly, the weight of the moment settling over him. She thought the fight was pointless. She thought we'd fall. But here we are. Still standing. Johnny pushed off the bench, his steps steady as he began walking again, the city stretching out before him. The wild ones had returned to their timeline. Lancaster was healing. And the multiverse still needed him. The woman's challenge had been clear, her doubt sharp, but she hadn't understood the truth he carried with him. The Vandukes didn't fight for glory, for recognition, or even for victory. They fought because someone had to. Because if they didn't, no one else would. And as Johnny Vanduke moved through the quiet streets, the dawn breaking around him, he knew one thing for certain: the mission would never end. And that was exactly why it mattered. Johnny's boots crunched against the debris as he approached the ruins of the FEAR box. The monolithic structure that had once dominated the skyline now lay shattered, its dark presence reduced to little more than twisted metal and scorched earth. The air around it still carried a faint hum, a residual energy that whispered of the power it had once held. As he stepped closer, he noticed movement among the rubble. At first, it was faint shuffling, staggering shapes barely able to rise from the wreckage. Then he saw them clearly, a small group of FEAR agents, their black armor cracked and broken, their masks shattered, fragments barely clinging to their faces. Beneath the remains of their helmets, human faces stared back at him, pale and hollow, marked by hatred and despair. They were pitiful, barely standing, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and pain. Yet, even in their weakened state, their eyes burned with a venomous intensity, fueled by the darkness that had sustained them through the battle. One of them, a man whose mask hung loosely from his face, took an unsteady step forward. His voice, though weak, carried a sharp edge. "Do you think yourself a hero, Vanduke?" he spat, his words dripping with disdain. "Do you think your victory here means anything?" Johnny stopped, standing tall amidst the rubble, his gaze steady. He didn't answer, letting the silence hang in the air between them. Another agent, a woman with blood streaking her face, sneered. F.E.A.R could have brought unity to the world. Under one belief, one purpose. We could have ended the chaos, the division. There could have been peace. World peace, another echoed, his voice strained but insistent. And you destroyed it? You tore it apart because you couldn't see the truth. You couldn't see what FEAR was offering. Johnny's jaw tightened, his hand brushing the grip of his magnum, though he made no move to draw it. He stared at them, these remnants of F.E.A.R's army, their words clawing at him like nails on glass. They believed what they said. He could see it in their eyes, the fanatical conviction that still burned within them, even as their bodies betrayed their weakness. "You think you've won," the first agent said, his voice rising with a desperate fervor. "But you haven't. You've doomed this world to chaos, to destruction. FEAR could have saved it." Johnny took a step forward, his presence casting a long shadow over the group. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but filled with the weight of truth. "You don't know what you're talking about." The agents flinched at the certainty in his tone, their bravado faltering. Johnny's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing as he continued. "This was never your fight. This wasn't supposed to happen. You think FEAR was bringing unity? That it was some grand plan for peace? It wasn't. It was never about peace. What are you talking about, the woman demanded, though her voice wavered. Johnny's expression darkened, his voice dropping lower. This isn't your timeline. The battle you're fighting, the war you're dying for, it's not even real. It's a fabrication. A lie. The agents exchanged confused glances, their hatred momentarily eclipsed by doubt. F.E.A.R. wasn't supposed to invade Lancaster, Johnny said, his words deliberate and cutting. In the original timeline, FEAR targeted Los Angeles, California. The Wild Ones fought their battle there. That was where their fight was meant to happen. But this. He gestured to the ruined city around them. This wasn't supposed to exist. This timeline, your timeline, was altered. The first agent's face twisted with confusion, his bravado slipping. Altered? What are you talking about? Johnny stepped closer, his voice unrelenting. Your religion, your war, your F.E.A.R. it's all a lie. A manipulation. The false storyteller and the imposter twisted the timeline, bending it to their will. They used FEAR as a pawn, a tool to spread their influence and destabilize the multiverse. You think you were fighting for unity? You were fighting for them. You were nothing more than their puppets. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, the weight of the truth pressing down on the agents. They stared at Johnny, their expressions a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. Their fanaticism, the hatred that had sustained them, began to crack under the force of his words. You're lying, one of them muttered, though his voice was weak, lacking conviction. Johnny shook his head. I don't have to lie. The proof is all around you. Look at what you've done, what FEAR has done. Do you see unity? Do you see peace? All I see is destruction. Pain. And that's all it was ever meant to be. A tool of control. A weapon to break the multiverse. The agents faltered, their knees buckling as the weight of Johnny's words crushed the last vestiges of their defiance. Their hatred, their conviction, had been the only thing keeping them standing, and now even that was slipping away. Johnny's gaze softened, though his voice remained firm. You were used. You were pawns in a game you didn't even know you were playing. But it's not too late. You can still walk away from this. You can still choose to live. The first agent dropped to his knees, his hands clutching the broken remains of his mask. The others followed, their bodies sagging as the truth they had fought so hard to deny finally broke through. Johnny looked at them, his heart heavy. He didn't feel triumph or vindication, only sorrow for what they had become. For what they had lost. Their broken form seemed even smaller now, the weight of his words already beginning to crush the dark resolve that had once sustained them. The fire in their eyes was dimming, but Johnny wasn't done. Not yet. You still don't get it, do you? Johnny's voice was sharp, cutting through the still air like a blade. His hands clenched at his sides, his expression hard but not cruel. You think you're part of some divine mission, some higher purpose that FEAR has given you. But you're not. You're not soldiers of destiny. You're the leftovers of a story that was never supposed to happen. The agents stared at him, their hollow eyes flickering with the last remnants of defiance. One of them, the man who had first spoken, managed to croak, "What do you mean?" Johnny stepped closer, his presence towering over them. In the original timeline, your war began in 2012. Los Angeles was your battlefield, not Lancaster. You waged your fight there, and the Wild Ones beat you. They tore FEAR apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ashes. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. But it didn't end there. In the original timeline, FEAR came back years later. You called it the Veil Wars, your so-called resurgence. And guess what? You lost again. The Wild Ones beat you a second time, just like they did the first. The woman among the agents, her face streaked with dirt and blood, shook her head weakly. You're lying. We were chosen. FEAR is eternal. Johnny let out a bitter laugh, his voice tinged with both anger and pity. Eternal? No. You're not eternal. You're not divine. You're a fabrication. A shadow of a story that was never even yours to begin with. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing as he delivered the final blow. F.E.A.R. wasn't some divine creation. It was a story. A story told by someone who never even realized she had the power to make it real. Her name was E. Black, and she was just a girl. A writer with a vivid imagination, who had no idea that her words could create worlds. That her thoughts could bring something like FEAR into existence. The agents froze, their breaths catching as the weight of his revelation hit them. Johnny pressed on, his voice unrelenting. She didn't mean for this to happen. In the original timeline, she crossed over into the world of the Wild Ones and discovered she was a storyteller, just like me. She realized that the war, the Wild Ones, F.E.A.R. all of it was a product of her imagination. A story she had written. And you? He pointed at them, his tone cutting like a blade. You're just characters in that story. The man's broken mask slipped from his face, clattering to the ground as his features contorted in a mix of disbelief and anger. You're lying, he muttered, his voice trembling. You have to be lying. Johnny shook his head, his expression firm. I wish I was. But the truth is, your religion, your war, everything you've believed in, it's all a lie. FEAR is nothing more than the creation of a girl who didn't know the power of her own mind. And the worst part? Even in her story, you never won. Not once. The agent's silence was deafening. Their shattered armor and fragmented masks now mirrored the cracks forming in their minds as Johnny's words dismantled everything they thought they knew. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If we're just a story, then what are we? What's the point of any of this? Johnny's gaze softened, though his resolve remained unshaken. You're not nothing. You're here. You exist. But you've been chasing a purpose that was never real. You've been fighting for something that doesn't exist. FEAR was never about unity or peace. It was a tool, a pawn in a bigger game played by the imposter and the false storyteller. You're not soldiers of destiny. You're victims of their manipulation. The agents slumped further, their bodies trembling as the last remnants of their hatred and conviction drained away. For the first time, they looked like what they truly were: broken, lost people who had been used and discarded by forces far beyond their understanding. Johnny took a step back, his gaze lingering on them for a moment longer. You don't have to be this. You don't have to let their lies define you. You can choose something else. You can choose to be better. Without waiting for a response, Johnny turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet as he left the agents to grapple with the truth. The ruins of the FEAR box loomed behind him, a monument to the lies and manipulation that had driven this war. As he stepped into the shadow of the city, Johnny knew one thing with absolute certainty: the mission would never end. But neither would the truth. And as long as he stood, as long as the Vandukes endured, the lies of the false storyteller and the imposter would never go unchallenged. The ruins of the FEAR box faded into the distance behind Johnny as he walked through the silent streets of Lancaster City. The air felt heavier now, thick with the lingering energy of the battle and the weight of what he had just revealed. His steps were steady, but his mind churned. As the original storyteller, Johnny Vanduke carried a burden few could comprehend. He wasn't just a fighter or a protector, he was the architect of truths and destinies. He had seen the threads of timelines stretch and snap, their fates bent by whispers of influence, their courses altered by those who didn't understand the power they wielded. He paused at a crumbling wall, leaning against it as he let the cool night air wash over him. He closed his eyes, reaching deep into his essence, tapping into the ethereal sight that allowed him to see beyond the immediate, to touch the vast web of the multiverse. It was a skill he rarely used outside of combat, but now, he needed clarity. The world shifted around him, the material plane dissolving into threads of light and shadow. The multiverse unraveled before him, an infinite tapestry of timelines and possibilities. He saw the cracks left behind by the false storyteller's tampering, the jagged edges of realities that didn't fit together. Each fissure was a reminder of how precarious the balance had become. Johnny's gaze focused on the origin point of the story he had just told, the timeline where Eve Black had first penned the tale of the Wild Ones and FEAR. He saw her now, a young woman sitting at her desk, her hand moving feverishly across a notebook. Her brow was furrowed, her eyes alight with inspiration, but she had no idea that her words were pulling at the threads of reality. He exhaled slowly, his thoughts heavy. She didn't know. She couldn't have known. But ignorance didn't absolve responsibility. Eve had inadvertently created a story so powerful that it had bled into existence, giving rise to a war that should never have been. And now, it had been twisted even further, manipulated by forces that sought only chaos. But what struck Johnny wasn't just the damage, it was the potential. Eve had been a storyteller, just like him, and her words had shaped worlds. She hadn't known her power, but it had been real. It was a power he understood all too well. His vision shifted again, this time to the altered timeline where the FEAR box had risen in Lancaster instead of Los Angeles. He saw the fractures where the false storyteller had intervened, rewriting the course of history to draw F.E.A.R's war to a new battlefield. The changes were deliberate, precise, designed to destabilize the multiverse further. And yet, even in the chaos, Johnny saw something else: resilience. The people of Lancaster had survived. The Wild Ones had fought alongside him, and together, they had pushed back the darkness. The timeline was scarred, but it wasn't broken. His sight returned to the present, the threads of the multiverse fading as he opened his eyes. The city around him was quiet, but it felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The battle was over, but the echoes of hope remained. Johnny straightened, his resolve hardening. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could ensure the story didn't spiral further into chaos. He could confront the false storyteller, face the imposter, and reclaim the balance that had been lost. As he walked through the streets, his mind raced. He had always known his role as the original storyteller came with responsibilities, but this felt different. The false storyteller's manipulations weren't just about power, they were about erasing identity, twisting truths into weapons. FEAR had been a tool in that grand design, but it wasn't the end game. The agents he had left behind lingered in his thoughts. Their broken forms, their shattered faith, it all spoke to the deeper cruelty of the false storyteller's plan. They had been pawns, convinced they were fighting for a cause greater than themselves, only to discover they were fragments of a story not their own. As he turned a corner, he came upon a small group of survivors working to clear debris from the streets. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, but they moved with quiet determination, rebuilding their city brick by brick. One of them, a young man covered in dust and sweat, looked up and saw Johnny. His expression shifted, a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You're the one who stopped them, aren't you?" he asked, his voice tinged with reverence. Johnny paused, meeting the man's gaze. "I'm just a part of it," he said simply. "It's all of us who stopped them." The man nodded, his grip tightening on the broken beam he was lifting. "Well, thanks for everything." Johnny gave a small nod and continued walking, his thoughts heavy but focused. He had seen countless timelines, countless versions of himself, countless battles. But this timeline felt different. The people here weren't just survivors, they were fighters, creators, storytellers in their own right. The multiverse was vast, and its threads were fragile, but it was also resilient. Johnny knew the mission would never end, but he also knew that every battle, every truth, every choice mattered. And as long as he stood, the story would continue. As he approached the city's edge, where the stars burned brighter against the vast expanse of the multiverse, Johnny Vanduke, the original storyteller, tightened his grip on the .44 Magnum at his side. The battle here was over, but the war for the multiverse had just begun. And he would face it, armed with the truth and the unyielding resolve of a man who knew the power of a story. Johnny Vanduke stood at the edge of the call sign network portal, staring into its swirling vortex of light and shadow. His thoughts lingered on Eve Black and the revelation he had just uncovered. Much like himself, the Vandukes, and Lancaster City, Eve, and Los Angeles were a multiversal certainty, fixed points in the vast, chaotic web of existence. They weren't anomalies. They were anchors, places and people through which the multiverse flowed with undeniable force. Johnny had always believed Lancaster was unique, the singular point on Earth where the multiverse threads converged. But now, he knew otherwise. LA was another such place, its own heartbeat resonating through the infinite layers of time and space. And just as Lancaster had chosen its protectors, so too had Los Angeles. E. Black, the unwitting storyteller, was as much a part of this cosmic equation as Johnny himself. For a long moment, he pondered the implications. Two cities, two anchors, two protectors. If Eve was like him, then perhaps she had also been pulled into battles far beyond her understanding. But unlike him, she wasn't a Vanduke. She wasn't trained, prepared, or connected to the call sign network. She was alone, and her city was one of chaos. He couldn't ignore it. The multiverse had chosen her for a reason, and he needed to know why. With a deep breath, Johnny stepped into the portal. The air changed immediately as he emerged on the other side. The West Coast's warmth wrapped around him, but it was a heavy, oppressive heat, carrying the smells of gasoline, sweat, and decay. He was in Los Angeles, but not the glittering Hollywood image so often projected to the world. This was a darker corner of the city, a place where hope was scarce, and survival was a daily battle. The streets were cracked and littered with trash, the faint hum of neon signs buzzing in the background. Dilapidated buildings loomed around him, their windows boarded up or shattered. The air was thick with tension, the kind that told you danger wasn't just a possibility, it was a guarantee. Johnny adjusted his coat, his .44 Magnum hanging heavy at his side as he began walking. His boots echoed against the cracked pavement, the sound drawing attention from the shadows. Figures emerged, one by one, stepping out from alleys and doorways, their movements deliberate and predatory. Thugs and thieves, their faces hardened by years of desperation and violence, surrounded him. Tattoos marked their skin, crude weapons glinted in their hands, and their eyes burned with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they had the upper hand. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His voice was low, dripping with menace. "You must be lost, friend. Don't see too many people like you wandering into our part of town." Johnny stopped, his stance calm but firm. His eyes scanned the group, taking in their weapons, their postures, their intent. They were used to people fearing them, cowering under their presence. But they had never met a Vanduke. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Johnny said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen far worse than this. The thug laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "That's so? Well, see, the thing is, you're in our territory now. And if you want to walk out of here, it's gonna cost you." Johnny tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "And what exactly do you think I owe you?" The thug's grin widened, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Everything you got. Wallet, phone, watch. Hell, that fancy coat looks like it'd fetch a nice price too. So why don't you make this easy on yourself and hand it over?" Johnny's smirk faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, the thugs tensed, thinking he was about to comply. But instead, his hand emerged gripping the .44 Magnum, the weapon gleaming ominously in the dim light. The group froze, their confidence faltering. The scarred man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of unease. "You think you're some kind of cowboy, huh?" he sneered, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Johnny's gaze was ice cold, his voice steady. "I've walked through hell and back. Fought things you wouldn't believe. Monsters. Machines. Gods. And you." He took a step forward, the group instinctively stepping back. "You're not even a warm-up." One of the younger thugs, emboldened by desperation, lunged forward with a switchblade. Johnny moved like lightning, his free hand catching the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and with a swift kick, Johnny sent the thug sprawling. The others hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they realized this wasn't a fight they could win. Johnny leveled the Magnum at the scarred man, his expression unreadable. "This is your only warning. Walk away." For a moment, the thug seemed to consider pushing his luck, but the look in Johnny's eyes, the sheer, unyielding intensity, made him think better of it. He raised his hands and took a step back. "All right, man. We're done here." The group slowly retreated, melting back into the shadows from which they had emerged. Johnny watched them go, his stance unwavering until he was certain they were gone. He holstered the Magnum and looked around, taking in the chaos of the neighborhood. This was Black City, a place teetering on the edge, and it had chosen her as its protector. She had been pulled into a world she couldn't fully understand, a role she hadn't asked for. But the multiverse didn't care about consent, it cared about balance. As he began walking again, Johnny's thoughts turned to Eve. If she was anything like him, she would have questions, doubts, fears, and she would need answers. The multiverse had brought him here for a reason. It was time to find Eve Black. The air in the broken streets of Los Angeles was thick with tension as Johnny Vanduke wandered deeper into the heart of chaos. The sounds of shouting grew louder with each step, the unmistakable clash of voices fueled by desperation and greed. He rounded a corner and found himself facing a brewing war, a standoff between two rival gangs. They were armed to the teeth, their weapons glinting in the dim streetlights, their postures screaming hostility. It was a battle for territory, a fight to claim what little control they could over a city that seemed to resist taming. Johnny observed from the shadows, his fingers brushing against the grip of his magnum. He was ready to step in, to put an end to this senseless violence, but something stopped him. A sound, low at first, almost imperceptible, began to rise. It was a hum, vibrating through the air, growing in intensity until it became a piercing, unnatural scream. The force of it was staggering. Windows shattered into shards, crumbling to the ground like brittle leaves. Smaller structures groaned and buckled under the pressure, their walls cracking as the sonic wave tore through the area. The gang members froze, their bravado dissolving into pure terror. One by one, they broke into a panicked retreat, their weapons abandoned as they fled from the unseen force. Johnny stood his ground, the call sign network's energy enveloping him like an invisible shield. The scream washed over him, its power undeniable, but he remained unharmed. As the last of the gang members disappeared into the night, silence fell over the ruins. Johnny's eyes scanned the area, his senses heightened, searching for the source of the scream. The air was heavy with residual energy, crackling faintly like the aftermath of a storm. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, calm, confident, and edged with knowing. "You're a long way from Lancaster, Vanduke." Johnny turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the speaker. The voice was female, strong but tinged with an almost casual amusement. And whoever it was, they knew him. From the shadows, a figure emerged. She moved with an effortless grace, her presence commanding but not aggressive. Her dark hair framed sharp, intelligent eyes, and she wore a leather jacket over a simple black shirt and jeans. Her stance was relaxed, her arms crossed, but there was a power to her that couldn't be ignored. Johnny's hand hovered near his magnum, his instincts sharp. "And you are?" he asked, his voice steady, though his curiosity was undeniable. The woman tilted her head, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "I'm Eve Black. And I know exactly who you are, Johnny Vanduke." The name hit him like a spark igniting a fuse. He had come here searching for her, the unwitting storyteller whose words had reshaped worlds, but he hadn't expected her to find him first. He studied her carefully, taking in every detail: the way she carried herself, the subtle confidence in her tone, the unmistakable aura of someone who had seen more than they ever wanted to. "You know me?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. Eve nodded, her smirk softening into something more thoughtful. "Oh, I know you. The original storyteller. Protector of Lancaster. Guardian of the multiverse." She gestured to him casually, as if listing off titles she had memorized. "You're kind of a big deal, at least in the circles that matter." Johnny's eyes narrowed. "How?" She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Because I'm like you, Johnny. A storyteller. And when you tap into the multiverse, you start to see things: threads, connections, people." She paused, her gaze steady. "I saw you coming long before you got here." Johnny's hand relaxed slightly, though he didn't let his guard down completely. "If you know so much, then you know why I'm here." Eve raised an eyebrow, her expression curious. "You're here because you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. You're here because you've realized LA is like Lancaster, a fixed point, a certainty in the multiverse. And you're here because you've figured out I'm the one tied to it." Johnny nodded slowly. "And what about you? You know what you are." Eve's smirk returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I know. I'm the girl whose imagination spiraled out of control and rewrote an entire timeline. I'm the one who brought FEAR into existence without even realizing what I was doing. And now I'm stuck trying to clean up the mess I made." Her words carried a weight that Johnny recognized all too well. She wasn't just speaking from knowledge, she was speaking from experience, from guilt, from the burden of knowing your choices had consequences far beyond what you could control. "You're not alone in this," Johnny said, his voice softer now. "You didn't ask for this, but neither did I. The multiverse doesn't care about what we want. It cares about balance. And whether we like it or not, we're the ones who have to maintain it." Eve looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. Finally, she nodded. "So, what now, Vanduke? You've found me. You've seen what my city's become. What are you going to do about it?" Johnny's gaze hardened, his resolve settling like stone. "We start with the truth. About you. About FEAR. About why LA is a fixed point. And then, we figure out how to set things right." Eve's smirk returned, though this time there was a flicker of something else behind it: hope. "All right, then. Let's get to work." Johnny and Eve walked through the dimly lit streets of LA, the sounds of the city a stark contrast to the quiet resilience of Lancaster. Here, the noise never stopped, cars roaring down the highway, distant shouts echoing from alleys, the sharp crack of glass breaking somewhere far off. It was a city alive, but not in a way that felt comforting. This was chaos, raw and unfiltered. Johnny glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in everything. His boots scuffed against the cracked pavement, and he spoke without looking at her. "This place is nothing like Lancaster." Eve walked beside him, her hands in her jacket pockets, her gaze straight ahead. "No, it's not. Lancaster's small." "What? About 58,000 people in the city. LA has millions, almost 4 million, just in the city proper. It's a whole different beast." Johnny nodded, his tone thoughtful. "Lancaster's quieter, even with its struggles. It's old, settled in the 1720s. The history there runs deep, but it's not a place of constant movement. People know each other. You walk down the street, and you're bound to run into someone you've seen before." Eve snorted softly. "Yeah, that's not LA. This city's always moving. People come here chasing dreams or running from something. It's transient. You could walk the same block every day and never see the same face twice. It's impersonal." Johnny stopped at a corner, his eyes scanning the street. A flickering neon sign illuminated the sidewalk, casting strange shadows on the cracked walls of a nearby building. "It's more than that. Lancaster's problems come from poverty, from an older infrastructure, from being stuck between the past and the present. But here this place feels different. It's like the city itself is fighting to hold itself together." Eve leaned against a nearby lamppost, her expression serious. "You're not wrong. LA's got everything glitz and glamour, sure, but also homelessness, gang wars, overcrowded schools, and an overworked police force. It's the best and the worst all smashed together. Lancaster might have crime, but here? Crime's woven into the fabric of the city." Johnny crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. "The gangs, what's the pull? In Lancaster, it's more scattered, more about smaller groups. But here, it's like a system." Eve nodded, gesturing down the street. "It is. Gangs here are generational. You've got groups like the Crips, Bloods, and MS-13. They're not just about survival, they're about territory, power, identity. Lancaster might see gang activity, but it's nothing on this scale. Here, it's like an ecosystem. And the people stuck in it? Most of them don't see a way out." Johnny's jaw tightened. "And the city lets it happen." "It's not that simple," Eve said, her tone defensive but not dismissive. "The city tries. But when you've got nearly 10 million people in the county, stretched resources, and deep systemic issues, it's like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose." Johnny sighed, leaning against the wall. "Lancaster's smaller, but it's not without its own issues. It's got one of the highest refugee resettlement rates per capita in the country. That brings challenges: housing, jobs, education. And there's the opioid crisis, like everywhere else. But it doesn't have this. He gestured around them, the sprawling urban chaos of LA. This scale. Eve's gaze softened, and she nodded. Yeah. Lancaster's problems feel human-sized. Like you can tackle them if you work hard enough. Here, it feels like the city swallows you whole. They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sound of sirens echoing through the night. So why is it a fixed point? Johnny asked, his voice quiet but direct. What makes LA so important that the multiverse flows through it? Eve tilted her head, considering. Because it's a hub. Not just for people, but for ideas, culture, stories. Think about it: Hollywood, the entertainment industry, tech in Silicon Valley just a few hours away. LA's the place where dreams are made or crushed. It's not just a city. It's an idea. And ideas have power. Johnny frowned, his mind racing. Lancaster's important because it's where the Vandukes come from. It's a foundation, a starting point. But LA, it's a beacon. A place that pulls people in from everywhere. Exactly, Eve said. It's a city that shapes the world without even trying. What happens here ripples outward. Movies, music, fashion, they all start here and spread across the globe. Lancaster grounds the multiverse, but LA drives it. Johnny nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. Two fixed points, two cities. One grounded in history, the other driven by change. And both are critical to keeping the multiverse in balance. Eve smirked faintly. So, what's the plan, Vanduke? You came all this way to figure me out. Now that you have, what are you going to do about it? Johnny looked at her, his gaze steady. You're the protector of the city, Eve. Whether you wanted it or not, the multiverse chose you. And if this place is anything like Lancaster, it means trouble is never far behind. Her smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Trouble's already here. You've seen what it's like. FEAR might be gone, but this city's problems run deeper than that. Johnny pushed off the wall, his stance firm. Then we fix it. One piece at a time. The multiverse doesn't just throw us into the fire for no reason. If we're here, it's because the city needs us. And together, we'll figure out how to make it right. Eve studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, Vanduke. Let's see what you've got. As Johnny and Eve turned a corner, the tension in the air shifted, sharp and immediate. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hardened, their hands gripping weapons, pistols, bats, and knives. Gang colors marked their allegiance, and their eyes glinted with menace. Eve muttered under her breath, just another night in LA. Johnny stepped forward, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of his magnum. "You don't have to do this," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the thick air. "Walk away." The leader, a burly man with a scar running across his temple, laughed a harsh, guttural sound. "This is our turf. You're the ones who need to walk away." Johnny's eyes narrowed, his stance shifting slightly. "Not gonna happen." Before another word could be exchanged, one of the gang members lunged, swinging a bat aimed at Johnny's head. He moved like lightning, catching the bat mid-swing and yanking it from the thug's hands. A quick, precise kick sent the attacker sprawling. The rest of the gang hesitated for a split second, but then chaos erupted. Two rushed Johnny, while another went for Eve. She moved with practiced ease, ducking under a wild swing and driving her knee into the attacker's stomach. A sharp elbow to the jaw sent him crumpling to the ground. Johnny faced his attackers with the precision of someone who had fought battles far more dangerous than this. He sidestepped a knife thrust, twisting the assailant's arm and disarming him in one fluid motion. A punch to the ribs, followed by an uppercut, left the man gasping for air. The leader, seeing his crew falling apart, drew a gun, his hand shaking slightly. He aimed it at Johnny, but before he could fire, Eve let out a sharp whistle. A burst of sonic energy rippled through the air, shattering the gun in his hand and sending him stumbling back, clutching his ears. Johnny stepped forward, his magnum drawn but pointed at the ground. "You've lost. Don't make it worse." The leader glared at him, breathing heavily, but he didn't argue. With a muttered curse, he gestured to his crew, and they retreated into the night. Eve crossed her arms, smirking slightly as she looked at Johnny. "Not bad, Vanduke." Johnny holstered his magnum, his expression calm but firm. "Not bad yourself. Let's hope they think twice before trying that again." They continued walking, the tension easing as the city's chaotic hum returned to its usual rhythm. For now, the fight was over. But Johnny knew LA wouldn't let them rest for long. As they walked through the dim streets of Los Angeles, the night air buzzing with distant sounds of the city, Eve broke the silence. "So, Johnny," she said, her tone casual but curious, "what's the East Coast like? What's Lancaster County like?" Johnny glanced at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "It's different. Lancaster County's a mix of old and new, history and progress. It's got this quiet charm that sneaks up on you if you let it." Eve raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Quiet charm? Doesn't sound like a place with much action." Johnny chuckled softly. "Depends on where you look. Lancaster City's the hub of it all, small compared to LA, but it's got character. The streets are lined with old brick buildings, farmers markets, and murals. It's the kind of place where people know each other, where community actually means something." "And the county?" Eve asked, genuinely intrigued. It's sprawling, Johnny said, his tone thoughtful. Drive 10 minutes outside the city, and you're in farmland as far as the eye can see. Rolling hills, covered bridges, Amish buggies, people come from all over just to see it. But Lancaster County isn't just rural charm. It's got a lot of towns with their own stories. Like, she prompted. Millersville, he began, his voice steady. Home to Millersville University. It's got this college town vibe but still feels grounded. A mix of young energy and the quiet pace of the surrounding area. Then there's Columbia, Johnny continued. It sits right along the Susquehanna River. Used to be a major transportation hub back in the 19th century. Now it's a mix of antique shops, small town living, and some of the best views of the river you'll find. It's peaceful, but you can feel the weight of its history. Holdwood, he said, his tone shifting to something more reflective. That's a different kind of place. It's rugged, lots of forests and trails. The Holdwood Dam is out there, part of the river's power infrastructure. You hike through there, and you feel like you've stepped back in time. It's raw, untouched in a way most places aren't anymore. Eve nodded, picturing the scenes he described. Sounds like a postcard. Johnny smirked. In some ways, yeah. But then you've got places like Mountville. More suburban. Quiet streets, family homes, and small businesses. It's where people go when they want a little bit of everything, close to the city but far enough away to breathe. And Peach Bottom? She asked, tilting her head. Ah, Peach Bottom, Johnny said, his tone lightening. Down near the Maryland border. Small, rural, but it's home to the Peach Bottom nuclear generating station. Feels strange, this sleepy little area with a nuclear plant humming in the background. But the people there? Salt of the earth. Hard-working, unpretentious. Paradise? Eve asked, her lips quirking in a slight grin. Does it live up to the name? Johnny laughed. Depends on who you ask. Paradise is another small town, tucked in the heart of Amish country. It's quiet, picturesque, the kind of place where you can hear the clip-clop of horse hooves on the road. It's got this timeless quality, like it's been untouched by the chaos of the modern world. Eve looked at him, her curiosity giving way to something softer. It sounds peaceful. Like the kind of place where you can just be. Johnny nodded, his gaze distant. It is, in its own way. But it's not perfect. Lancaster County has its struggles: poverty, the opioid crisis, the weight of history pressing against the march of progress. It's not the chaos of LA, but it's got its battles. He paused, glancing at Eve. But it's home. And no matter how far I go, no matter how many timelines I walk, it'll always be that. Eve walked in silence for a moment, absorbing his words. You make it sound like a whole other world. Johnny smiled faintly. Maybe it is. Just like LA is yours. These places, they're more than just cities or counties. They're part of who we are, whether we want them to be or not. Eve nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time, she found herself wondering if she could see LA the way Johnny saw Lancaster, not just as a place of chaos, but as a home worth fighting for. As the two continued walking through the dimly lit streets of LA, Johnny's curiosity shifted. He glanced at Eve, who seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed ahead as if she were navigating through memories as much as the city. "What about you?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. "What's your story, Eve? How did you end up here?" She hesitated, her steps slowing. For a moment, Johnny thought she might brush off the question, but then she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "My story isn't exactly like yours, Vanduke," she began, her tone quieter than usual. "I didn't grow up in some historical cornerstone of the multiverse. I'm an LA girl through and through. Born here, raised here, and whether I like it or not, shaped by the city." Johnny nodded, waiting for her to continue. "It wasn't an easy life," Eve admitted, her eyes scanning the street ahead. "My family wasn't well off. My dad worked 3 jobs, and my mom, well, she wasn't around much. She bailed when I was 9. It was just me and my dad after that." Johnny didn't interrupt, letting her find her rhythm. "We lived in one of the rougher neighborhoods," she continued. "Gang activity, crime, drugs, it was just part of life. You learned to survive. You kept your head down, your mouth shut, and you prayed you didn't get caught in the crossfire. And did you?" Johnny asked gently. Eve let out a dry laugh, her gaze distant. "More than once. Got mugged walking home from school. Got jumped for no reason a block from our apartment. And one time, a stray bullet from some gang fight tore through our kitchen window while I was doing homework. That's just how it was." Johnny's expression darkened. "That's no way for anyone to grow up." Eve shrugged, her tone resigned but not bitter. "It was what it was. But here's the thing about growing up in a place like that, it either breaks you, or it makes you stronger. And me." She glanced at Johnny, a small, defiant smirk tugging at her lips. "I refused to break." He returned the faint smile. "I can see that. I buried myself in books and writing," Eve said, her voice softening. "It was my escape. I'd create worlds, characters, stories where I could control what happened. Where people like me weren't just victims, they were heroes. That's how FEAR started. It was just a story at first, something I came up with to make sense of the chaos around me." Johnny's brows furrowed. "And then it became real." Eve nodded. "Yeah. I didn't even realize it at first. One day, I was writing, and the next, It was like I was living inside my own imagination. I saw things I'd only dreamed up. Felt the threads of the multiverse pulling me in directions I didn't understand. It was terrifying. But you adapted, Johnny said, his tone sure. Had to, Eve replied. The first time I crossed into another timeline, I thought I was losing my mind. But then I realized I wasn't just making things up. I was tapping into something bigger. Something real. Johnny nodded, understanding in his gaze. And that's when you realized you were a storyteller. Yeah, she said, her voice almost a whisper. It changed everything. Suddenly, all those stories I'd written weren't just stories anymore. They were worlds. People. Real lives. And F.E.A.R. She paused, shaking her head. That was the hardest part. Realizing I'd created something so monstrous without even meaning to. Johnny's expression softened. You didn't know, Eve. You couldn't have. I know, she said, though her tone carried the weight of guilt. But that doesn't change the fact that it's my fault. That's why I stay. LA is my city, just like Lancaster is yours. And as long as I'm here, I'm going to protect it. From FEAR. From the multiverse. From everything. Johnny watched her for a long moment, her words resonating deeply. You're doing more than protecting it, Eve. You're giving it a chance. She glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. And what about you, Vanduke? What made you take on the burden of the multiverse? He smirked faintly. It's a long story. Eve chuckled softly. I think we've got time. And as the two walked through the chaotic streets of LA, their stories began to weave together, two protectors, two cities, united by the multiverse and their shared determination to make a difference. Johnny walked in silence for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Telling his story wasn't something he did often, but Eve deserved to know. She had shared her own struggles, and it felt only right to offer her the same understanding. It started a long time ago, he began, his voice steady but reflective. Back in Lancaster, when I was just a regular kid. My name wasn't even Johnny Vanduke then. I was Bradley Eshelman, just another face in a small city. Eve glanced at him, intrigued. So what changed? Johnny smirked faintly. Everything. I didn't know it at the time, but Lancaster isn't just another city. It's a fixed point in the multiverse, a place where the threads of time and space converge. And I was tied to it. Always had been, even before I understood what that meant. He paused, his gaze distant. I was just a kid when I started seeing things. Shadows that weren't supposed to be there. Lights that flickered at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought I was going crazy. But then, I started to understand. It wasn't just shadows or lights. It was the multiverse. I could see it, feel it, like the whole thing was whispering to me. Eve raised an eyebrow. And you didn't think to ignore it? Johnny chuckled. I tried. Believe me, I tried. But Lancaster had other plans. The city started pulling me into its secrets, ghost stories, hidden tunnels, strange symbols carved into old buildings. Every time I tried to ignore it, something would happen to drag me back in. Like what? Eve asked, her tone curious. Johnny's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. There was a night I'll never forget it. I was 17. A friend of mine dared me to explore one of the old abandoned factories on the outskirts of the city. It was supposed to be haunted, just another local legend. But when I went in, I saw something. What kind of something? Eve pressed. Not something, Johnny corrected, his voice dropping. Someone. A man dressed in old clothes, his eyes glowing like embers. He looked at me like he knew me, like he'd been waiting for me. He called himself the Storyteller. Told me I was part of something bigger. That Lancaster wasn't just a city, it was a gateway. And I was meant to protect it. Eve stopped walking, staring at him. And you believed him? Johnny sighed. Not at first. But then he showed me. He opened a portal, right there in the factory. I saw the multiverse for the first time, timelines, possibilities, worlds stacked on top of each other like layers of glass. It was beautiful. And terrifying. He continued walking, his tone more thoughtful now. That night changed everything. I realized Lancaster wasn't just home, it was a responsibility. And the name Vanduke? That's part of the legacy. Every timeline, every version of Lancaster, has a Vanduke. Protectors of the multiverse, bound to the city and its secrets. So you became the original storyteller? Eve asked. Not right away, Johnny admitted. At first, I was just trying to survive. The multiverse is a dangerous place, full of things that don't belong anywhere. Monsters. Machines. People who'd sell their own souls for a chance to rewrite reality. The more I traveled, the more I realized how fragile it all is. He looked at Eve, his gaze steady. But Lancaster isn't just a fixed point. It's an anchor. And the Vandukes are part of that anchor. We're not just protectors, we're part of the multiverse's balance. And as the original storyteller, it's my job to make sure that balance holds. Eve nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. So you've been doing this for how long? Johnny smirked faintly. Feels like forever. Time doesn't work the same way in the multiverse. But let's just say I've seen a lot. And you've been fighting the whole time? She asked, her tone carrying a hint of awe. Fighting, fixing, surviving, Johnny said. The Vandukes have faced everything you can imagine: zombies, necromorphs, wendigos, skinwalkers, water demons, and worse. And now, we're in the middle of a war against the imposter and the false storyteller, two beings who are trying to tear the multiverse apart. Eve let out a low whistle. No wonder you came here. Sounds like you've been through hell. Johnny stopped, his gaze meeting hers. I have. But that's the mission. It never ends. And I'll keep fighting, no matter how big the task or how many enemies stand in the way. Eve studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Well, Vanduke, I guess that makes two of us. Welcome to LA. Johnny smiled faintly, his resolve hardening. Thanks. Something tells me the city's going to keep me busy. Eve chuckled, and the two of them continued walking, their paths now entwined as they prepared to face whatever the multiverse had in store for them next. As they walked deeper into the city, Johnny paused at a quiet intersection, the chaos of Los Angeles momentarily muted. He turned to Eve, his hand brushing the inside of his coat where the call sign device was clipped. Its faint, pulsing glow was a constant presence, a subtle hum of energy that connected him to the multiverse. You've seen the multiverse, Eve, he began, his tone steady. But I don't think you've seen it the way I do. The way a Vanduke sees it? Eve tilted her head, intrigued. And what way is that? Johnny reached into his coat, pulling out the device. It was unassuming at first glance, a small metallic disc etched with intricate symbols that seemed to shift under the dim light. But as he held it up, the air around it shimmered, as though the very fabric of reality were bending to its presence. This, Johnny said, his voice firm, is the Vanduke Call Sign Network, or VCSN. It's how the Vandukes stay connected. Across timelines, across universes, this is our anchor. Our map. Our weapon. Eve's eyes widened slightly, her curiosity sharpening. It looks small. Johnny smirked faintly. Small, but powerful. It's more than just a tool. It's a key to the multiverse. He pressed his thumb against the center of the device, and it came alive. A sphere of light expanded around them, casting an ethereal glow over the crumbling street. Within the sphere, lines of light began to form a web of interconnected threads stretching outward in every direction. Each thread pulsed with its own rhythm, a living map of the multiverse. Eve's breath caught as she took a step closer, her eyes scanning the intricate network. This is incredible. Johnny nodded, his gaze fixed on the map. Every line you see is a timeline. Every point of light is a fixed location, places like Lancaster, like LA. And these, he gestured to the glowing threads. These are the connections. The paths we can take. Eve reached out instinctively, her fingers hovering near one of the glowing lines. It's beautiful. But, how does it work? Johnny tapped the device again, and the sphere shifted, zooming in on a single thread. The VCSN lets us travel between timelines. It's like a compass and a vehicle all in one. But it's more than that. It's also how we communicate. Every Vanduke is connected through this network. No matter where we are, no matter how far apart, we can always find each other. Eve stared at the shifting lights, her mind racing. So this is how you've been able to fight across so many timelines. How you've been able to keep the multiverse balanced. Johnny's expression darkened slightly. It's part of it. But the VCSN isn't perfect. It's been compromised before, hacked, fractured, nearly destroyed. That's what the imposter and the false storyteller want. If they can break the network, they can sever the connection between the Vandukes. They can divide us. Eve's gaze sharpened. And if that happens... Johnny's jaw tightened. If that happens, the multiverse collapses. Without the VCSN, we can't maintain balance. The fixed points fall apart, timelines bleed into each other, and everything unravels. Eve studied him, her expression thoughtful. But you've kept it running. You've kept it safe. For now, Johnny said, his tone heavy. But it's a constant fight. Every time I use it, every time I open a portal or send a signal, there's a risk. The imposter is always watching, always waiting for a chance to strike. Eve nodded slowly, her gaze shifting back to the glowing map. And you trust me enough to show me this? To let me see your biggest tool? Johnny's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. You're a storyteller, Eve. Whether you like it or not, you're part of this. LA is a fixed point, just like Lancaster. And if the multiverse is going to survive, we need you as much as you need me. Eve smirked faintly, though her tone carried a note of sincerity. Well, Vanduke, looks like we're in this together. Johnny deactivated the device, the sphere of light collapsing back into the small metallic disc. He clipped it to his coat and gave her a nod. Welcome to the network. Eve grinned. Let's hope it's as badass as it looks. Johnny chuckled softly as they continued walking, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. The multiverse was vast, its challenges relentless, but for the first time, Johnny felt a flicker of something unexpected, hope. Together, they might just stand a chance. As Johnny and Eve continued their walk through the crumbling streets of Los Angeles, the faint hum of the Vanduke call sign network still resonating in the air, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Two protectors, each forged by their cities, each burdened by the weight of their roles, now walking a shared path. Johnny glanced up at the sky, where the faint glow of the city lights barely allowed the stars to break through. Somewhere, beyond the noise, the chaos, and the cracks in the multiverse, there was balance. Fragile, yes, but achievable. Eve broke the silence with a smirk. So, what now, Vanduke? We've got a multiverse to save, 2 cities to protect, and a whole lot of trouble waiting to find us." Johnny chuckled, his hand brushing the grip of his magnum. "We do what we always do. We keep moving forward. One step at a time." Eve nodded, her resolve matching his. "Well, Johnny, if the multiverse thinks it can throw us a challenge we can't handle, it's got another thing coming." Together, they disappeared into the night, 2 protectors united by purpose and determination. The story wasn't over, far from it. But for now, the city breathed a little easier, and the threads of the multiverse held firm. For now, the balance endured.